Welcome back to Whiskey Politics. I'm Dave Sussman, your host and purveyor at whiskeypolitics.net. You can find us all through our social media apps, YouTube, America's Voice News, Ricochet.com, and of course, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play. So this is a quick introduction. Forgive my casual attire, but this is what you're going to be hearing or watching today is actually a pre-recorded interview. I flew out to Las Vegas to interview today's guest, Don Blankenship, and I just wanted to do a quick introduction and give you a little bit of perspective before we got started. A couple of points. First, logistics. This is a long interview, and it goes against what most of our interviews are as far as time goes. This is about a 2.5-hour interview, and I know people like Joe Rogan does that every day, but that's not our normal format. So we will be splitting this up and putting it out in about 3 different segments after this initial one goes up. But you're going to be hearing the whole unfiltered interview today that Don Blankenship and we sat down in his incredibly beautiful home in Las Vegas. They flew me out. And I'm going to just say this up front. When I was asked to interview Don, I was in two minds whether I wanted to. Up front, the initial response that I had was a little bit uncomfortable. What I knew about Don Blankenship is basically what I saw from the news, like most people. The news media had raked him over the coals, and he was the butt of many late night comedians. John Oliver especially did an entire segment on his company, Massey Energy and coal, and especially in regards to Don's campaign against Senate West Virginia Manchin. The reason that I was uncomfortable was, quite frankly, I felt that the information that I had learned about Don, which again, through the media, was that it was, I was uncomfortable with some of the discussion about racism. I was uncomfortable with the fact that he was indicted on 4 felonies, even though they were dismissed. He did end up serving time in jail for a misdemeanor. And it all stems back to an event that occurred in 2010 with his company, Massey Energy. And this is where I became a little bit more interested. And the deeper I dug, I realized that there is an incredible story behind the scenes here. And I hadn't read about it or seen it unless you go dark web, deep web, and find out that the entire hit against Don was stemming from politics, especially the Obama administration and the Labor Department that used its MSHA, the Mining Safety Hazard Health Agency, to go in and change the rules of mining. Now, Massey Energy had hundreds of mines around the country. They're in coal. They're, I think, the 6th largest company at the time in the country. And what had happened is that there was a fight by the Obama administration against coal. And they used their agencies like MSHA to come in and start changing the rules, making it extremely prohibitive and actually dangerous to continue mining. One of those rules that they changed was the airflow through the mines. And Massey's engineers they fought this tooth and nail, saying that what you are telling us to do is to restrict the airflow. This would lead to an explosion. 24 hours after this was implemented by law, Upper Big Branch, a mine in West Virginia, blew up. It exploded, killing 29 miners. Now, could you imagine being the president, CEO of a large organization like this, and all of a sudden one of your mines explodes after you have warned MSHA of what will happen, and 29 families are now dealing with the death of a loved one because of what was implemented? So this is where I started to become really interested. And I said, okay, there's a story here, and I think it's really fascinating. And I'm going to tell you, the reason that we went 2.5 hours in this interview was because, like layers of an onion, the more I peeled it back, we are dealing with politics, we're dealing with corruption, We're dealing with pressure. We're dealing with, obviously, the financial aspects of dealing with such a large industry like coal. And we know what happened in 2016. Hillary Clinton herself came right out and said that she wanted to close the industry down. So there was definitely a push towards that, and they used the agencies to do such. Now, where I was uncomfortable was some of the things that, and we talk about this, that came out of the last couple of years after Don Blankenship came out of jail. He ran a campaign, and there were some discussions about cocaine Mitch. And this is where the story and the term for Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, stems from. And we're going to learn all about that and how that came up. Why call the Senate Majority Leader Cocaine Mitch? And we also talk about a lot of other issues as well, and relating to Joe Manchin, the unions who made Don Blankenship enemy number one going back 30 years. And I found it to be absolutely fascinating. I think you will too. And whatever you think of the man, and again, my initial impression of him before meeting with him and sitting down, again, was definitely, I'll use the word reserved when I was asked to whether or not I could be flown out and do this interview. I'm glad I did it. I think you will as well. It's a fascinating story, worthy of a book or a movie. And let us know what you think when this goes up on YouTube or Ricochet. It's also going to be shown at America's Voice News and all of our podcast applications. So sit back, pour yourself probably a few drinks, 2.5 hours, and enjoy the Whiskey Politics interview with Don Blankenship. And I'm Dave Sussman. Welcome to America's Voice News. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for joining us. If you are not watching us on America's Voice News, you can find this on YouTube and also all of your podcast applications, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, as well as the Ricochet Audio Network. So with everything that's been happening the past few weeks regarding half of America waking up and realizing that they may have been lied to for the past 2.5 years by their media, a lot of people have started to ask questions about the reliability of news reporting. And one such report that came out over the past couple of years has been about an individual. It's also been about an industry, an entire industry, the coal industry. And if you were like me, before I started looking into everything we're about to talk about today, I certainly had my opinions based upon what the media were reporting, especially with folks on HBO like John Oliver and a lot of the news reporting that's out there, until you realize that there is always another side of the coin. What am I referring to? Well, the curious case of Don Blankenship. You may know Don from the news that was talked about over the past few years regarding his tenure over Massey Coal, one of the largest coal companies in the country, an explosion that took place that led to the deaths of 29 miners, a court situation that led to indictments and actually jail time. And everything before then and after then as well, something that I want to get into because I think you're going to find it to be extremely fascinating. I know I did. So welcome, and I would also like to welcome for the show Don Blankenship. Don, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dave, for having me.
It's a pleasure. So first of all, before we get into all of the issues that, and there's a lot that I want to talk about with you and ask you about, and I appreciate you having us here to be open. Two things. First, before we get into some of the history here, one of the, I think, if I was in your position, probably would be one of the most gravest days in my lifetime. But everybody that is watching this probably knows you from the incident that took place, I think, in 2010 at the Upper Big Branch.
April 5, 2010.
Right. And this was at the Upper Big Branch mining in West Virginia, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. There was an explosion that took place, and 29 people perished. I have to ask you, just right on the start, what was that day like for you?
Well, it was a terrible day. You know, it began with a phone call that said we had CO on the belt line, which in the mining business means you've got smoke. And of course, normally it just turns out to not be much, but in this case, every call that I got, it was a little worse. The second call was that the CO levels had risen. And of course, we launched into an emergency program that we already had in place, which included contacting the government, contacting, our rescue teams and so forth. And in a few hours later, the bad news came that 6 miners had been discovered perished on the track. And as the day developed, of course, we ended up with 20-some fatals that day, and it took several more days to recover the bodies. So we ended up with 29 in total.
So the whole process took a few days then before you found out everything.
Took several days to recover all the bodies. I don't even remember the exact number of days, but it was horrific, both from the beginning and through the process of dealing with the families. The families were, of course, very upset and very emotional, and the press was already labeling us as responsible for the explosion because the media, if you will, took that side of the issue from the very start. So we were being called names both publicly and on site, but our focus for the first several days was recovering people and finding out what happened.
It must have been devastating, and I understand it was a mining town. Everybody knew somebody that was impacted by this, family members, friends.
Yes, it was in the heart of West Virginia's metallurgical coal fields, between Boone and Nicholas County, West Virginia, and it's an area that is known for a history of being a strong union area. It's an area that has provided both a lot of natural gas and coal since the 1900s. So it's coal's in their blood, so to speak.
When you're, as a CEO of Massey, okay, which is one of the largest, what is it, the 6th largest at the time?
6th largest in the U.S., but the
Right.
largest in Central Appalachia, which is the area where most of the high-quality coal was mined in.
And how many mines total were there?
We had 119 mine sections and so forth, but a lot of those were surface mines. Some were underground mines. This particular mine was the most productive mine in the eastern U.S. Because it was a longwall, what's called a longwall, which is different from normal miner sections and will produce as much as 4 to 5 million tons a year out of one mine.
Okay. So this was one of how many mines total?
About 119. Sometimes what constitutes a mine gets a little confusing because there'll be 2 different ways to get in the mine, and the government may treat it as one mine or as 2 mines, but there's 119 different mining operations.
So a company the size of Massey, when you have a tragedy like this, and I would relate this to an airline going down if you're the head of American Airlines or something like this, what is the protocol? What is that crisis management like for you during those few days?
Well, everybody has a role. Your safety director has a role. Your chief operating officer has a role. Chairman has a role. My role was, for example, contacting the governor, making sure the head guy at IMSHA was aware, making sure the board was aware, calling an emergency board meeting, setting up a crisis place, setting up facilities for families to be at while they are waiting for news on their loved ones, gathering rescue teams. All the coal companies work together. They all have rescue teams. And so you make contacts to have their rescue team come in to help because you're 24 hours a day. And so it's quite a chore, but the actual handling of the crisis I thought worked very well considering they're so rare and it was such a large operation.
I want to get into the politics, I want to get into the legal, I want to get into all of that with you this afternoon. But from what I understand, this was not a new profession for you. You grew up in coal, didn't you?
It's how I got through college, was working in the coal mines in the summers, and even after college, I had to leave West Virginia for a while, and as a typical West Virginian, I liked it there, so I came back for a while and worked in the coal mines even after I graduated college. So I was an unusual product from that area. I was a certified public accountant and an official certified coal miner. So there's not too many certified CPAs that are certified coal miners, and that's one of the reasons I think that I eventually rose to the level of chairman.
So you started out in college, you actually went into the mines, you got the dirt under your fingernails, you felt it, you understand what exactly the miners were doing on a day-to-day basis. Coming back again to 2010, I read a lot of reports that a lot of the people in the community were supporting you through this. They felt that you hadn't done anything wrong or the company hadn't done anything wrong. But if you were watch the media today or back 9 years ago now, they made it sound like it was a lot different. There were a lot of people that supported you that were in the mining community, correct?
The coal miners themselves supported us because they knew what Massey represented. We were in fact, I personally was the most prolific inventor of safety devices on equipment in the past 30 years. And we had the best safety programs, the best safety training. We had rules that far exceeded what the government rules were on safety. We always over-ventilated the sections. We had the best equipment. So it was a situation where the community knew what Massey stood for and what I stood for. But the media took off on the route of the drama, that there's a bad player and Massey's a bad company. Most of that stemmed from the 1985 strike and the fact that we were operating open shop in heavy union country.
So let's get into that in a little bit of detail here, because I think that definitely sets the genesis of everything that led up to 2010 and subsequently since that point. Go back to the 1980s. Go back to, you were in the mines, then you went away, and then they hired you back as a CPA, as you said, or as a controller?
Well, they didn't hire me back. I was working at other mining operations, and then I came to work for Massey. When Shell Oil bought Massey Coal in 1981 or 82, I think it was, they required that the mine's subsidiaries or the company's subsidiaries have CPAs overseeing the books. So they ended up offering me a job, which to me was coming back home. So it's because at the time I had been out of West Virginia for 5 years working in the food business. So I got a call from Shell Oil offering me a job probably 8 miles from where I was born. So I came back home, so to speak.
Okay. And you were in that role for how long? I
was an accountant, I guess, at Massey for about 5 years, and then I began to move up through the ranks and became chairman in 1990, I think it was. So I'd been there 8 years at the time I became chairman.
That's a pretty rapid advance.
Yeah, I worked my entire career. I got every promotion that was in front of me for my entire life. So I was very fortunate in that regard. I was gifted when I was born mathematically, and the combination of the math and the fact that I had mining experience sort of set me aside in the mining industry.
Right. So we're talking about, you talked about unions, okay? What happened in the 1980s? What happened in 1985 specifically?
Well, there's several different ways you could look at it. The union, of course, had been determined by Wharton to be the most violent union in America. In fact, there's a movie called, I think it's called Act of Vengeance, that stars Charles Bronson, where the union even killed their own candidate for union president, where Jacques Lebowski was killed by hitmen at the order of Tony Boyle. So that was about the year I graduated. I graduated high school in '68. We knew the union was extremely violent. This was only 4 miles where the strike I was involved in '85 from the Mate 1 massacre, which led to the only time that the United States dropped bombs on its own citizens in the United States. So the greatest civil uprising, they say, other than the Civil War in the U.S. So it was an area that was heartfelt union. The situation in the big picture was that Western coal was coming on in large volumes, and the Western coal that was 10 million tons in the 1970s, it was up into hundreds of millions of tons by the middle of the 80s. And it was so cheap to mine that you could not afford to pay in labor rate what they could pay in the West. And the union was demanding that the companies in the East pay the same amount of money that was paid in the West. Two totally different types of mining, two totally different products, but demanding they be the same. So a number of companies, including Massey Energy, withdrew from what was a collective bargaining unit of coal companies that would bargain with the union as a joint negotiation. And one of those companies that withdrew was Massey at the directive of Fluor and Shell. And I was running one of the strong union companies, again, just 4 miles from the Mate 1 massacre. We knew that Shell didn't really care because they're a multi-billion-dollar company, and a mining unit of 2 or 3 million tons wasn't going to affect their balance sheet. But we asked them if we could run the operation rather than shut it down. And when we did, being in the heart of union country, the violence got out of control. Ultimately, there was 91 people hospitalized over about a 15-month period. And eventually we prevailed, we being the company prevailed and was able to impose a contract that we could live with, and we discharged 90 union members. That led to me being labeled for the rest of my life actually as a union buster, when in fact all we were doing was saving hundreds of jobs, in fact thousands of jobs in southern West Virginia, by not allowing the union to dictate their employment terms.
Unions are obviously very political. Tremendous amount of power in Washington, D.C., in Charleston, West Virginia, most state capitals around the country. What impact did that have on the unions? When you talk about being considered a union buster and having that reputation afterwards, did that set in your mind the ball rolling to subsequent events that led to obviously 2010 and after that?
It probably led to the majority of the major events in my life after that, because I was labeled, Massey was labeled, we were branded to be union busters, and we expanded because we were running a lot of open shop mines and we had favorable union contracts, so we kept getting bigger. We grew from a company that was valued at $200 million up to a company that eventually sold for $7.5 billion. So we were huge, and we were probably bigger in that small area of the country than any company in whatever area they were operating in. And so we were, I think people resented how successful we were. The union was, angry that we were opening up more and more non-union mines. And they had great control over the politics. So civil cases, lawsuits in the state courts were always huge awards, hundreds of millions of dollars. And they also were able to impact the permit process and the regulatory process. And in fact, it's interesting that the upper Big Branch miners who came from union jobs, 70% of them we were required to hire off of union panels or union employment lists, and yet they voted to be non-union twice under NLRB supervised elections because they liked working at Massey so well. And of course they eventually, several of them were killed in the explosion in 2010.
When people think about unions in the United States especially, although they're worldwide, they think of protecting the worker, safety, making sure that they're paid, overtime, all of the things that we see with unions as far as what they put out to the public and obviously to generate union members. What is it that the public didn't know about these unions? You talked about the regulatory process, how much they had as an impact on that and what they were doing. But is there a side to the unions that the public are not aware of, especially when it comes to mining and the power that they have politically today?
Yeah, I think there's a huge difference between what they are and what they represent themselves to be. I mean, union is big business, and the presidents of the unions, they do very well, and basically it's the environmental movement's the same way. They're big businesses, and people look at them as fighting for the little guy, when actually they themselves are hoping to grow their union membership or whatever their cause is. In this case, Richard Trumka was president of the United Mine Workers during the '85 violent strike, and he's now president of the AFL-CIO, most frequent visitor to the White House, very influential under the Obama administration, and they had tremendous influence over which coal companies could get permits and how they would be regulated and so forth. So they're totally different than their core cause allows people to think of them.
Gotcha. And I want to get into that influence in the White House and that period that we got into. But before we get there, I want to go even further back a little bit now, because learning about you and the genesis to where you are, you're obviously a very smart individual. To grow into a company and lead a company that size and be promoted in that quick time period, obviously you were doing a very, very good job for the company. You said that in college you were mining. Go back even further than that. Where did you grow up in West Virginia? I
grew up in a town called DeLorme. About every town in West Virginia, by the way, has two names. It has the railroad name and the post office name. Okay. And the one I grew up in, the railroad name was DeLorme and the post office name was Egerton. And it was a town of about 400 people. It was sort of an anomaly in that it was right on the border with West Virginia, Kentucky, and West Virginia, not far to Virginia. And both Virginia and Kentucky were dry, and West Virginia was wet. So a town of 400 would become a town of 800 on Friday and Saturday night, particularly on payday weekend, and very violent. We probably led the nation in murders per capita. We just weren't big enough to make the list. But it was a very rough area, very coal-oriented. And we ran a family gasoline station most of my young years, so we had a lot of interaction with the public. And I put gasoline in coal miners' cars from the time I was 5 or 6 years old.
Single mother?
Single mom, and played baseball. When I was 17, I was playing in the men's baseball league of the coal miners. All the coal companies had teams, and that's how they entertained the communities on the weekends. Every Sunday there was big baseball games between the various coal companies, and it was an interesting time. You know, it was a time when coal was king in the United States. It was still fueling the Industrial Revolution. It was miners were proud and so forth, and it was not an industry that was under attack. It was an industry that was very fundamentally necessary in the country and very respected.
And the unions were obviously very powerful then as well, yeah?
Yeah, the union, to give you an idea of just how far off base the union supported Al Gore for president. They supported Barack Obama for president. They supported John Kerry for president. All those candidates for president were anti-coal. So the UMWA was basically operating not for the benefit of its people, it was operating for the benefit of itself. So.
How much of that, I know we're jumping around a little bit here, but you raised an interesting issue. How much of that is about power as opposed to environmentalism? Because you said Richard Trumka, for example, he was the most, he was, if not the, certainly up there as far as number of visits to the Obama White House. I think he was the number one, right?
Yeah, he brags on YouTube that he was the most frequent visitor to the White House.
Right. Okay, so how much of it is a push towards environmentalism and green energy, and I want to talk about that with you as well, as opposed to just consolidating power and not enjoying, some of the things that took place earlier on with Massey and other coal companies as well?
I think that becomes a personal thing. I think it's the same thing that's going on in the swamp in D.C., that people get so focused on the power and so focused on their title and so focused on the fact they can go to the White House and ride limos and have butlers and all the things that goes on in their personal life that they lose track of their purpose. And I think that's what happened to Richard Trumka. I told Trumka and Roberts one time when I went to their office in D.C. that I would know that they were living in the real world when they didn't have the lady in the elevator to push the buttons for me. But they would never allow companies to become efficient because of technology. And they were, they still had an elevator operator when all you had to do was push the button, even in the 80s and 90s. And that was symbolic of how backward thinking they were.
Yeah. So again, going back to your childhood and your upbringing, and as after college, and obviously coming back into coal, moving back home again. Again, you are. This is in your blood. This is what you knew. This is what you grew up with, and the people around you, and you knew. So again, jumping ahead here to 2010 and that fateful day, and then you have this community that is obviously in shock and grieving. This was almost like family to you.
Yeah, I mean, having been around coal miners all my life, and like I say, played baseball with them, knew a lot of them personally, and having, if you will, gone through the grueling job of being a coal miner, I had tremendous respect for them. Yeah. At the same time, I had enough knowledge of the math of the business and of what the union was doing that I knew that if I was going to do the right thing for the miners, it wasn't going to be necessarily popular with the miners, and it certainly wasn't going to be popular with the union. The unemployment in southern West Virginia in 1984 was probably 20-some%, and because of the western coal, and the union didn't seem to care at all that if it went to 100%. And so when we decided that we would run coal against the union, that sort of set in motion this ideal that I didn't care about the coal miners. But the fact is, I cared far more about them than the others. I risked my life for them, and we did more to make them safe than anybody in the history.
When you say you risk your life for them?
We walked through picket lines, endured death threats. At one time, I had 20 bodyguards. I was shot at more than one time. My office had 11 bullet holes in it. I had my children and I had to move them under bodyguard for more than a year and a half.
And the people that were perpetuating, they were union members? What?
Yeah, they were. They actually, one of the truck drivers for a mine nearby us during one of the strikes was shot 27 times by a professional killer. He had killed a coal miner in Ohio and got off on parole or some sort of technicality after a few years in prison. 27 days after he was off of supervised parole, he showed up in East Kentucky near one of our mines and killed a coal miner. Another one was killed in Logan County. We had, I think, 5 shot one day, including a wife of one of our non-union workers who was shot in her home. So they put 90-some people in the hospital, so we fired 91 of them. And it was like a war zone. CNN came in with their flak jackets on out of Nicaragua at the time, and one of them was saying it can't be as bad as we're here. And I said, well, if you want to ride a coal truck tonight down the road here, we'll go and see whether it's that bad. And they didn't want anything to do with that. They'd just come out of Nicaragua and they wouldn't get in a coal truck.
Wow. 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 Well, this is where it comes from, obviously, a business situation with the influence of the union, and it turned into something political and something legal. And I want to get into this in much more detail, and I appreciate the overview. And we're going to take a quick break. We're going to be right back. So I'm here with Don Blankenship, and we're talking a lot about behind the scenes of what took place, the other side of the coin with Don Blankenship. I'm Dave Sussman. We'll be right back at America's Voice News. And Dave Sussman back with you at America's Voice News, and I'm delighted to be joined with Don Blankenship. And we were just talking, Don, about kind of a genesis of where you came from to what led you to be running one of the largest coal mining companies in America, and the tragic day in 2010. But what happened subsequent to 2010, I think if anybody that has been watching the news or during that period of time or watched some of the late night comics or, some of the television shows that focused on you, and I will admit this myself, it definitely colored my opinion of you. There's a tremendous amount of information that was very much one-sided, and the way that information was presented about you and what took place turned you into, I think, what Rolling Stone magazine called, the Dark Night of Coal, or the Dark Lord of Coal, okay? And a couple of other publications calling you the most hated man in West Virginia.
Well, on the other side, the pro-coal guys called me the one-man army, so.
The one-man army. So it was definitely based upon perception. It was definitely based upon who was writing the copy. But let's talk about this, because the fact is that you did actually end up serving jail time. And if you go to your Wikipedia or any other information that's out there right now, convicted felon, even though I want to talk about that with you, and a lot of other information that's out there that until you actually look beneath the surface, it definitely paints a dark picture of you. Just getting to know you and speaking with you here today, first of all, seeing this information, seeing John Oliver doing this piece on you, I'm sure you saw it. What was that like for you personally?
Well, by that time, I'd become pretty used to it. If you go back to 1984, 85, I guess it's sort of like lifting weights. I got used to the media lying and so forth. In fact, I've never been involved in a story that I knew the detail of, that I recognized the story on television. It's been that way since 85, when they would pull our guys out of the vehicle and beat them up and shoot through my office, and the next morning I'd read the paper that there's no violence. And I think, where are these guys at? Because they were standing right there when they beat up one of the truck drivers. So I was used to that and used to the vilification over a period of time. About 2010, I had been vilified for 25 years, and sort of like water off a duck's back, and maybe too much so, because maybe I just didn't care anymore, because I figured I couldn't get the truth out there. When the explosion occurred, responsible people, of course, wanted to figure out what happened before they said what happened. But Barack Obama and the head of the Mine Safety and Health Administration, Kevin what was his name, Kevin Strickland, said that it was the operator's fault, and no one had even been underground to see what happened yet. So we were responsible, as we had been, in my opinion, our entire lives. I had a board that had the general on it that overseen shock and awe during the Iraqi war. I had the president of Ohio State University. I had an admiral that was the first one to recognize that the Russian ships were coming to Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had the former head of Delaware Haskins and Sells. We were a responsible board, and we were not going to go out and say we knew what happened when we didn't. And of course, the problem with that is the media ran with the story, and then the media couldn't change their story. And it was incredible, the childishness of the head of MSHA, not only saying that the operator blew up the mine, he sent an email to all the MSHA employees and said, remember, the operator blew up the mine, MSHA didn't. It reminded me of a kid breaking a window out with a baseball and pointing at the other kid and saying, this kid did it, when they didn't really know what happened, but they did know that they had cut the air in half just a few hours, or required it to be cut in half a few hours before the explosion, but they never mentioned it.
So I think this is a critical part of the story that hasn't been reported. You have to dig very, very deep to find this. So the Mining Safety Hazard Association, Health Association, they come in and they say to different mines, and explain for me as a layman here exactly how it works. They regulate the mines. Now, the people that are working for this administration, this association, are they engineers? Are they miners?
No, that's the odd part. Some of them are engineers.
Okay.
But the top engineers end up being employed by the companies because the A students, as I always said, want to make the 100 and some thousand a year, and the C and D students from the engineering, the few that go to MSHA, are the lesser qualified and so forth. But to be a mine inspector, you only have to have 1 year underground and have a college degree in any field. I could have been a qualified mine inspector, and I couldn't have done the technical work that needed to be done to properly regulate and put the electricity on the mines and everything. So it's a really odd situation. I think the key point is the Mine Safety and Health Administration regulates the mine, and then when there's an accident, they investigate. And if you were to go look at the investigation reports on, say, the last 300 accidents in the coal mines, you will see that the most popular words are either the operator failed or the victim failed. It's never that the government failed or that MSHA failed. And yet they have tremendous control over what's going on in the mine, tremendous control over the training, tremendous control over what the mine plan, the mine's cut sequence, the type of roof bolts. They have tremendous control but no responsibility. And the parallel I draw to make it easy to compare, if you have an airplane crash, the National Transportation Safety Board investigates, including investigating the regulator, the Federal Aviation Administration. So in the airline industry, it has the best safety record in the United States, of anything that is risky. And the fact that the FAA regulates and the NTSB investigates makes that possible, because if you regulate and investigate, you're never going to be at fault. And I've complained about that for a long time. In fact, right before I was indicted, I had done a documentary where I made the point that that's the single most important thing to change if you really care about coal miner safety.
Okay. So from what I understand and what I've read, MSHA came in before the explosion. And one of the things that is being discussed, and you've talked about this, it's been written about, but it's not ubiquitous. You can't find it it's not all over the media, is that MSHA required what? That there was going to be a reduction of the airflow in the mine? Explain what happened here.
Okay, first of all, let me say that the media wouldn't have had any trouble finding it. 60 Minutes was sitting in the audience when the lead witness for the prosecution in my trial testified in tears that he begged the government, he begged MSHA, he begged a guy named Joe Makoviak and another one named Hardman not to require that they change and reduce the airflow. The guy broke down in tears. The number 2 lead witness in the trial with 60 Minutes in the audience testified the same thing. He testified that he was required to cut the air and that they begged MSHA not to do it. So the fact was there. It's just never reported in the media. I mean, the government itself's two lead witnesses testified that they were required to cut the air by the Mine Safety and Health Administration.
For what reason?
It's complicated, but there are, when you have a mine, you have basically multiple tunnels, maybe 4 tunnels, maybe 6 tunnels, maybe 7 tunnels. And you take the air into the mine in 1 or 2 of those entries and take it out in 1 or 2 of those entries. One's called the intake entries and the other 2 are called the return entries. And most of the mines that have been in existence for a number of years, one of the 2 entries that takes the air in is the one that has the belt line in it. And the belt line has electric motors on it. The government got the idea that it would be better not to take air in across these motors because if it catch on fire, smoke would go to section and damage the men or cause the men not to have fresh air. So they took away at UBB the entry that had the belt in it. So you only had 1 entry, 1 tunnel to put the air in instead of 2.
Now the belt is what is a conveyor?
It's a rubber conveyor belt
Right.
that's motorized, and about every 3,000 or 4,000 feet you have another motor. And if you're 40,000 feet deep, you have 10 of these motors on there. And the belt itself can catch on fire from friction from time to time, but it's rare. But despite the advice of our top engineers in the world, despite the advice of a guy that was on our board as a doctor of mining engineering who ran the Penn State mining engineering program, and everybody telling them, you don't want to do this in this coal mine because it's big, it's deep, it's designed to have 2 intake entries, and they were insistent that the air not be allowed to go in on the belt entry. It took during the process, the Massey company engineers were fighting it so hard that we were getting a lot of violations because we didn't want to do it. We kept trying to give them alternatives, and the mine plan was being constantly changed, and that led to the violations that the government then argued were my fault, even though they were the fault of being required to make so many changes. But finally they totally succumbed, and on the weekend of Easter, which started I guess on April 2nd, 3rd, 4th, they were 3-day shutdown. So they finished the changes and finally completed them on Sunday night, and on the 3rd shift they left that morning, and 8 hours later the mine blew up.
I'm no engineer. It sounds to me like it goes against all common sense. You want airflow. You want as much fresh air as possible in the mine, no?
Yeah, it's like coal miners say the solution to pollution is dilution, and you have to have air. The problem you have is that the laws are so archaic. It goes back to MSHA. They don't really try to upgrade the laws, so they have the latitude and can subjectively make you do things you shouldn't do. To quantify what I just said, the law only requires 30,000 cubic feet per minute of air on a longwall. We were putting 120,000 on it because we knew that modern day mining is so much faster and so much more voluminous, and there's so much more dust that the 30,000 legal requirement was not put in place when this modern equipment was available. So we had 120,000. But when they cut it to 60,000, just to make the math easy, they were still twice the law, but they were half what we had had on it for 17 years. And so when the gas came out of the ground, which is another element of the things that the government ignored, you reach the explosive range, which the mine will only explode if the gas is between 5 and 15% of the atmosphere. And so you have to be in between. If you're above it, there's not enough oxygen to explode. If you're below it, there's not enough gas to explode in layman terms. So it got in that range because of the low amount of air and the vast amount of gas that was coming in, and they were cutting sandstone rock, throwing off sparks like you do when you're cutting hard rock with metal, and it exploded.
Now, there was a trial after this, of which grand jury indicted you on, was it 3 felony counts and a misdemeanor?
They made it a little complicated. It's 3 felony counts and a misdemeanor, but the misdemeanor and the felony count were part of one count. So they combined what they call conspiracy to willfully violate the law with a count that if you do that for the purpose of defrauding the government, it becomes a felony. So it was a little complicated, but in simple layman terms, 3 felonies and 1 misdemeanor.
Okay. and you went through the trial. Where in the trial did this come out regarding MSHA and them causing the reduction of airflow?
They were putting on witnesses. Probably about the fourth or fifth witness they put on was the guy that was overseeing the mine for Massey. He had gotten immunity for testifying against me, but he was the guy that was actually running the coal mine. And he testified that many of the violations were caused because of the air reductions and the constant plan changes. And he testified to, he and conversations he and I had had and so forth. And basically he included in his testimony when my lawyers asked him questions was that the air was reduced by 50% over his objections, and that he tried every way in the world to prevent him from doing it, but he couldn't stop him.
Gotcha.
And then a few witnesses later, they put on a guy, and this is a little complicated too, but the guy who had previously been in charge of the Mine Safety and Health Administration's ventilation in that district, the very district where this mine was, and he had worked for MSHA for 40 years. I knew that my engineers and the MSHA's engineers were arguing, so when the guy retired, I had my chief operating officer hire him, and he hired him to help us improve the conversations with MSHA and to make sure that we were able to make our points about the ventilation. Well, when he testified, he knew that he'd been hired for that purpose, and he broke down in tears that he begged the guy that had replaced him and also the guy that was his boss while he was there not to cut the airflow, and that they wouldn't listen to him. I mean, he was literally unable to talk on the stand for quite a period of time. They even took a break to give him time to recover because he said he couldn't stop him from cutting the air.
Okay. I want to get back to the court. I want to get back to the lawsuits and the indictments, which ultimately were dismissed, but you did end up going to prison. You went to prison for a misdemeanor, and I want to talk about that. But before that all happened, one of the things that, as I'm doing my research for this and I'm looking into this, is that this wasn't about the explosion, from what I can see. And it read to me, like if you do enough research on this, it sounded to me like you were targeted politically here. And you've said this as much as yourself. In fact, you've used I think the phrase political prisoner. Right, while you were in prison. So where did that stem from? You talked about in the 80s and the union busting and everything else. Let's talk about West Virginia. Let's talk about the politics of West Virginia. It was a blue state at the time, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a blue state at the time of the strikes. It had turned a little bit by 2010, but it's totally red now. But again, the stories are, it's complicated, but the bottom line is that the union was able to influence President Obama to put in charge of the Mine Safety and Health Administration a lifetime employee of the United Mine Workers who had worked directly for Richard Trump and Cecil Roberts most of his life. So we had this history with the union. The head of the Mine Safety and Health Administration is a guy that worked his entire life for the union. Obama has declared a war on coal. They target a mine that twice voted to be non-union under NLRB supervision. And so they come in there and they brag that they're going to make them change the airflow. In fact, one of the things that the guy was operating the mine that testified to was that the new head of the ventilation for MSHA told him, we're going to make you use this air plan that we want to use. And they did that by writing violations on top of violations and running up the violation count, and then they give them more and more power to force you to do what they wanted to do. But it all stemmed from the 85 strike, the Obama war on coal, the fact that the Mine Safety and Health Administration was being run by former UMWA people, and the fact that they wanted to attack the company and the person that they saw as the one that had caused them so much grief over the previous 25 years.
Now, you refer to the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board. Does MSHA fall under that?
No, MSHA falls under the Department of Labor.
Okay.
But so they're sort of sister arms, I guess. But
Okay.
the MSHA is a branch of the Department of Labor. And actually they oversee more than coal mines. They oversee all mining of all kinds.
Gotcha. Because that's a very political administration. I mean, was it Tom Perez that was in
Yes, Tom
NLRB?
Perez.
Now he's running the DNC.
Yeah, you can get into a lot of detail on that, but Tom Perez actually asked for the phone number of the prosecutor when I was indicted and sent him a note of congratulations that he had indicted me. So.
What was that?
I don't know. You know, we didn't learn about that. Again, the story is so long, but MSHA destroyed documents, had shredding parties, withheld information.
Shredding parties.
Yeah, they had a shredding party. The investigation team had a shredding party during the criminal investigation. The chronology is always hard to put together. They tried me while withholding information, having shredded information, and they tried me with a prosecutor who was the son of a federal judge in the same federal district who was going to run for governor.
Right.
And the judge was running around town telling people that his son was going to convict me because it was worth $1 million in earned campaign money.
Right.
For having convicted me. But they really didn't even charge me until I did a documentary that said that, you know, they had caused the mine to explode by cutting the air in half.
Yeah, you spoke out, and so you know, we talk about the unions, but again, coming back to my initial question on this particular state, West Virginia, at the time it was a blue state. It eventually became a red state, and I understand that you were you played a major pivotal role in that happening. And so when I take a look at this, I take a look at it, and the reason that I think this is such an interesting story is because it isn't just about the mine. It isn't just about unions or union busting. There's politics and power. And I want to get to a little bit later with you talking about how you decided that you wanted to run as well. But go back to the state of West Virginia, because I think I've been to West Virginia. I've been to Charleston. I've been to Huntington. Okay. Gold Leaf Capitol Building, statues of Robert Byrd everywhere downtown. What was West Virginia like politically during this period of time, and what was the impact that you had that's been, you know, from your standpoint of changing that dynamic?
Well, first of all, the politics was very corrupt in West Virginia, very well known, you know, vote buying and all that kind of stuff that was going on. The union was very much in control. And what was happening, the court system and so forth was so bad that West Virginia won the award as the judicial hellhole of the United States. And it was
That's an award.
Yeah. Yeah, just like I won the award for the worst man in America or something. But
Okay.
you know, it was a situation where the court system was so bad that a guy named Warren McGraw, who was the Supreme Court justice, was featured on Forbes magazine as being unbeatable. He campaigned on the fact that he never ruled against a workers' comp claimant.
Now Supreme Court justices in West Virginia are elected. They're not appointed, correct?
Yes, they're elected.
Okay.
And it's easy to get elected if you're pro-union and you're, you know, pro-worker and you never voted against a workers' comp claim and all that. But he had, you know, he basically was putting the entire coal industry at risk. There was a case that involved flooding, and he was of the mind that if the coal company could be shown to have increased the amount of the height of the floodwaters by 1 inch, they were totally responsible for the flood. I mean, it was all kinds of crazy stuff. And every time a case would go to him, he would rule for whoever the claimant was and against the business defendant. So West Virginia was 50th in the nation in business climate. Unemployment was horrible. We were the biggest employer. We were trying to grow. We were trying to take care of the coal miners. We were fighting regulators, environmental groups, the court system. And I decided that, actually, not me originally, the coal industry decided that Warren McGraw had to be beat. So the coal industry went out to beat Warren McGraw, raised a lot of money, and they knew they couldn't beat him with a red guy, a Republican, so they tried to beat him in the primary. And they missed him a small amount. McGraw won anyway, despite all the businesses, not just coal, but every business in West Virginia trying to beat him. So after the primary, they gave up. And I said to them, we can beat him with a Republican. And they said, well, a Republican hasn't won a race for West Virginia Supreme Court since 1920. And I said, well, you know, there hadn't been a non-union mine put in West Virginia from 1920 to 1985, and, you know, we're going to try it. So I did a lot of research on him, and one of the things I found that was most difficult for him on his record, that he had voted to release a pedophile from prison early. And the guy, you know, had several counts. I think it was 9 or 10 or 11 counts of pedophilia. So I decided that I would try to beat him. I couldn't get any help. So I spent $4 million of my own money and made sure the public knew that this guy had released a pedophile. And lo and behold, we were down 87-13 in the first poll, and we beat him. I think it was 52-48.
First of all, let's just, because I understand that this wasn't just a pedophile, multiple counts, but the judge released him. He was supposed to serve how long of a period of?
I think it was 35 years.
35 years, and he released him how long?
Just a few months.
A few months.
Yeah, and they not only allowed but ordered that he work at a school. And then if you want to get the real kicks out.
Wait, I'm sorry. The judge ordered him to work at a school, a convicted pedophile.
And that's not even the most insane part of it. The next part of it was that the West Virginia Public Broadcasting brought the guy on television for 30 minutes and tried to distinguish between him being ordered to work at a janitor at the school versus a custodian, because I had to run an ad in the campaign that he was ordered to work as a janitor, and they made the distinction in a tax paid for program that he was actually ordered to be a custodian, which meant he was working after school hours.
Okay. Why? Why would a judge do this? Was there a relationship? What was going on there?
I'm not 100% sure why he did it. He actually was, according to people that I knew, pretty tough on crime in general. But I never did understand why he did it. He first denied that he did it during the campaign. Then he started to explain why he did it. And eventually it just beat him. It's actually, I think, used at several universities, my campaign against him, as one of the most negative campaigns that was ever run or something. They use it, I believe, at Wake Forest in some schools.
Okay.
And their law department.
So your case study.
Yeah. The big difference was I was telling the truth about him. I mean, we actually, when he first denied it, we changed the commercial and brought the actual document that he had signed with what it said and pulled it up on the screen so people could read it.
Was that a shock to the system in West Virginia when he lost?
Oh, it was a total shock. Yeah, I put up a billboard because nobody knew who our guy was. His name was Brent Benjamin, and I never knew him. I called him to my office and talked to him about 5 or 10 minutes just so I'd know who he was. And I put up.
He didn't expect to win.
He didn't. Nobody thought he had a chance.
Okay.
In fact, you know, you could have won a lot of money betting on that he'd win. But I put up billboards all over West Virginia that said, "Who is Brent Benjamin?" And people would stop at gas stations and talk about, what does that sign mean? Who is Brent Benjamin? So between June and November, he became an unknown to everybody in the state. Was wondering who is Brent Benjamin, and he won.
So this was a major shot across the bow to the power, to the elite.
Oh, it was big time.
Blue State wakes up, says, okay, what's going on here? But that wasn't it. You didn't just end there, did you?
No, they did a documentary on me called Kingmaker, and they showed how upset the McGraws were, because there was actually 2 McGraws, and one of them was Attorney General and one was head of the Supreme Court, and they were extremely angry, and of course that led to more difficult times for Massey. I was having a difficult time with my board because they were of the mind, you know, lay low and let's run. I was of the mind that we crossed that bridge in '85 because of the strike, and you know, there's no way back. You know, we gotta just stand for what's right. And so things went on, and we continued to grow, and the state got a lot better, and unemployment went down, employment went up, and things got quite a bit better until Obama got in office.
Right. So by the time Obama got in office, the state had changed significantly, hadn't it?
Yeah, the coal industry was doing pretty well under Bush and so forth, and you know, in Clinton it wasn't bad, and we had made a big change in the way the industry ran. Massey's focus on safety, and you know, I created everything as simple as reflective clothing. When I first became president of Massey, you couldn't hardly see a miner in the coal mine in the dark. but we totally dressed them in reflective clothing as a very cheap safety enhancement. And then we did a lot of technical things on tram enablers and so forth, and things that Caterpillar and Joy Manufacturing now use were developed by Massey. So we were very prolific both on the safety side, the political side, the business side, the environmental side, but we never got any credit for it because we were constantly under attack.
And I want to get to that right after the break here coming up. I want to talk about the Obama administration. And I mean, you are right now on a path to essentially war, because you've got the Obama administration coming in. They didn't like coal from the outset. They campaigned against coal. In fact, Hillary Clinton in 2016 also did the same thing. So I want to talk a lot more about this, and again, going back to the trial. Dave Sussman here with Don Blankenship. We're going to be right back after the break here at America's Voice News. And Dave Sussman back with you at America's Voice News, and I'm very pleased to be with Don Blankenship, the Dark Lord of West Virginia, if you read Rolling Stone magazine. But no, before we get to the Obama administration, I just want to touch back upon real quickly here, because I think, you know, when we take a look at this from a macro perspective, you know, 50,000-foot overview, and we take a look at this genesis that led up to the trial and subsequently jail time and everything else that took place. When you talk about the state of West Virginia, in 2004, you basically took out one of the most powerful men, politically speaking, in the state of West Virginia.
Considered by Forbes to be unbeatable. And actually, Brit Hume wrote a book about him. So.
Brit Hume wrote a book about him?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and basically said he was a great politician. He was one of those guys that, you know, if he walked into a room, he was a great orator and he could motivate people and so forth. He just had very far left ideas.
Gotcha. So from there, you said, holy cow, we just took out this numero uno guy. West Virginia wasn't red right away. What happened from there? How did that trajectory continue?
Well, there was two things that happened that were, if you will, sort of peripheral to the actual election of, Republicans. Was a fight over the food tax and a fight over a bond. At the time, Governor Joe Manchin, who's now the U.S. Senator from West Virginia, wanted to indebt the state by $5.5 billion in order to fund the teachers' pension fund. And as the largest taxpayer in the state, I decided that I should not be for that. So I announced that people should vote against that bond. And the governor called me to his office quite upset and did everything from say that I shouldn't be doing that to offering me a position on some board that they had there in the state if I would not oppose it. And I told him that I had to oppose it because it made no sense. And it went for quite a while, but he even went on TV and told people not to listen to me. And he scheduled the bond on Saturday morning vote during miners' vacation when nobody would be in town, particularly coal miners. They all go to Myrtle Beach. So he basically had it set up where he was going to win. I went on television and told people to vote against it because they could pay the teachers' pension fund without going $5.5 billion debt. Nobody should borrow money and put it in the stock market. And so we won that battle. To say the least, the governor wasn't very happy. I think we won it. It was big, something like 65-35 or 55-45 was a large margin. And then I decided that the food tax was wrong. They shouldn't have it either. And I really don't know why I decided that, other than the fact that I still knew a lot of coal miners, and I knew that, I played basketball with guys on welfare all the time, even though I was a CEO, and I knew how tough it was. And I just decided that of all the things you should tax, food wasn't one of them, groceries. So I embarked on a campaign to get rid of the food tax, which I eventually did. Or they did. They didn't do it right when I started it, but over a few years they got rid of it. But I had alienated.
Literally a kitchen table issue.
A kitchen table issue. And needless to say, Joe Manchin was not happy. Because one of the reasons they were doing the bond was all the lawyers, plaintiff attorney lawyers that had made big donations to Manchin's campaign were going to get their license to write bonds, and they were all going to get big fees. If you get 6% of $5.5 billion, a lot of money.
Yeah.
So it was political payback in my view.
So I have to ask you this. I mean, from a standpoint of you're going after the party. You were using kitchen table issues, okay, allow people to keep more money in their pocket, and you won on that. What is going on right now, and I just want to kind of step out of the sequence of things right now, but when we take a look at the rest of the country right now in 2019, you see the state of Illinois, you see the state of California, you see the state of New York. They're overtaxing their citizenry. And there's actually been propositions, for example, in the state of California last year, there was a repeal of the gas tax, and it failed. It failed. So from your standpoint, how do you win? You turned a relatively small state from blue to red using kitchen table issues. Is that something that can still be done, or is it no longer a viable proposition today to do something like this, as we just saw in California?
I think you can do it if you deliver the message in a way that the average voter understands it. You know, that's one of the problems. It's so many times if you're if you're living in a glass house and in the big house, you don't understand how the smaller part of the population is living.
Right.
People that can't afford to buy cheerleading uniforms and can't pay their house mortgage, and they're riding a car that they can hardly keep running. If you can touch those people, they can be red people instead of blue people, to use the political side.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think that's when we talk about tax cuts on the national level, we don't really talk about tax cuts in the element of the society that needs the tax cut. And certainly people who are working for minimum wage and paying tax on their food when they go to the grocery store are people that are not normally thought of.
So I'm in complete agreement with you, and I went to Leadership Institute some years ago, and it was all about the messaging. Okay, it was Morton Blackwell. It was all about the messaging. And one of the biggest problems conservatives or right of center types or libertarians have today, especially in this fast-paced media that we live in, is that the message stinks. Okay, I can stand up and I can talk about free markets and low taxes and less regulation, but people, it just goes over their head. How did it work for you?
Well, I mean, I've seen Steve Forbes and all those guys on TV, and I've watched them sitting beside of people that are working for a regular job, and they don't pay taxes. You know, people that are $19,000 a year don't pay any taxes. So, but they do pay taxes on food. They do suffer from government waste. So if you can talk about the taxes they're paying or the life they're living, then I think you can make headway. And that's the difference. I mean, the Republican brand of we're going to cut your taxes doesn't work when very few people are paying income taxes. You know, all the taxes are paid by the people that are already in the Republican camp.
Right.
So you got to find a way that your policy is going to impact the average American or even the below average wage earner. And that's what Trump basically did. You know, if you look at my video documentary that I did called Reg-Session, which is a play on the two words regulation and recession, that we're not in a recession, we're in a session that's permanent caused by excessive regulation. It is exactly the campaign that Trump ran on, the platform he ran on. But it was obvious that the blue-collar workers in Michigan, Pennsylvania, coal miners, whatever, autos, wherever, that they had been disenfranchised by the Democratic Party. It was obvious that the trade policy is driving not only the trade debt, but also driving, you know, the budget deficit. And I said, anyone that will touch on that issue will still get the Republican vote if he's running on the Republican ticket, but he will get more crossover Democratic votes than anybody since Reagan. Reagan got it on personality, but on trade policy and on excessive regulation, you will get typical blue-collar voters, you know.
So what you're seeing right now with Donald Trump, I mean, for every one new regulation, he's repealing 23 or something, right? So you think that's going to have an impact in 2020?
Oh, it's huge. What it is that's being Main Street president instead of Wall Street president. You know,
Gotcha.
For years, the buzzwords on television were, you know, is this Wall Street or Main Street? But, you know, the trade policy has been a Wall Street policy for the last 40 years.
Right.
George Washington's policy was purely Main Street. You know, he believed that you had to have a tariff on every product that came into the country, basically.
Okay.
And the establishment fights that so hard, including the guy Steve Moore that was just put on the
Yes.
Federal Reserve. I know him personally, and he and Kudlow, if you go back and look at Kudlow's old stuff, I mean, trade policy is to say that you're going to have tariffs, sacrilegious. I mean, they just go nuts if you tell them you're going to have tariffs. And yet now they're part of the team that's supposedly in support of tariffs. But it's not a matter.
Well, they're being used as a tool, though. It's not the ends, right? It's the means right now.
Yeah, what I say about tariffs is we use tariffs and sanctions when we're trying to keep somebody from building a nuclear bomb.
Right.
We use it. But the way the Republicans should have sold it, and Trump can do a better job of selling it now, it's an environmental issue and it's a human rights issue. If you allow countries that are violating people's human rights and employment, they don't have any rules, and that are, if you will, damaging the environment to bring products into the U.S. untaxed, then you're basically polluting the world. And so it's an issue the Republicans have missed a great opportunity for a long time, because when you put the tariff on the product coming out of Bangladesh or somewhere, then you can use that tariff to require that they improve the environmental stewardship and improve the way they're treating people. And that's the way it should be used from a social viewpoint.
Right.
But it also allows the American worker to have a competitive chance. That's the reason I also coined the word a competitionist. I'm not a protectionist or a free trader. I'm a competitionist. I believe that competition works in capitalism, and it'll work in trade between countries.
Well, this is now leading up to about 2008, 2009, with Obama coming in. But there was a lot of discussion around this time about clean coal, new technologies for clean coal. But what we're seeing around the world is a situation right now where you've got emerging countries, you've got countries obviously you've got China, you've got India, And as far as the discussion that's taking place from an environmental standpoint, that is that when you take a look at the world's greatest polluters, you're talking about China, you're talking about India, you're talking about new coal that is over there. From your perspective, as a man who has spent his entire life in coal, how do you answer that as a threat to environmental pollution? Because if it comes up in the air in China, it's going to dissipate, but it's certainly going to spread over to the United States. People feel it. America, from what I can see right now, is a relatively very clean country. But what about the threat of coal overseas and the emerging markets?
Well, first of all, I don't see coal as a threat. I mean, coal is what made the United States what it is today. And it's complicated, but we spent billions and billions of dollars of taxpayer money to get rid of mercury emissions, arsenic emissions, NOx emissions, sulfur emissions, soot, you name it. We spent billions of dollars to get rid of it. These coal plants in this country were among the cleanest burning coal plants in the world. Then we decided that something that is natural in the atmosphere, CO2, that we should put all these coal companies out of business. The effect of that is that all that pollution that we got rid of in the worldwide atmosphere, arsenic, mercury, sulfur, soot, whatever, NOx, it now is being emitted in countries that took those jobs and took those products from us. So that's the reason I call the Environmental Protection Agency the biggest polluter in the world, because they took the greatest industrial giant in the world, put it out of business, and moved all that manufacturing and pollution to countries that don't pay attention to the environment. And the other truth that is unassailable is that people don't care about the environment until they got food on the table. They got all the basics. So they got to have clothing, they got to have food, they got to have water, they got to have shelter. Until they have that, they could care less about sulfur or arsenic or CO2 or anything else.
Right.
And so coal, which provided the lowest cost electricity for years and years, was fundamentally necessary to bring people to a level in their life that they could concern themselves with the environment and other issues. And that's what's happening in China and Asia and so forth. But the American worker paid the price for insane regulations that were touted as saving the environment, preventing the temperature from rising, when in fact they were polluting the world and destroying Detroit and bankrupting Detroit and big parts of America. So there's no logic to it. If there has to be math, everything in life has a cost and a benefit. And the benefit of trying to control the temperature of the earth by taking away the industrial might of 5% of the people of the world and moving all that pollution to the other 95% of the world is just totally illogical. It doesn't matter whether you believe in global warming,
Right.
whether you believe in CO2 makes a difference. It doesn't matter. You're not lowering CO2. In fact, CO2 emissions last year went up 2.7% in the world. And CO2 emissions historically have gone up about the same as the growth in the quality of life.
We've had Princeton Emeritus Professor of Chemistry William Happer on our show. And for those that don't know, he's now advising Trump on climatology, and we've had Norman Rogers on as well. And both men have pointed to the fact that we've had ebbing and flowing of CO2 levels going back millions of years, where, if it goes up from 350 parts to 400 parts per million right now, everybody's freaking out talking about, AOC is running around saying that we've got 12 years to live. But it's been as high as 4,000 parts per million in our history. But I think that there is a legitimate concern when we take a look at what you were just talking about, how we have exported this pollution. Is there any control mechanism that you could have from a global standpoint to use some of the same technologies that you were using for clean coal in the United States, in India and China?
Well, you should be. I mean, I think Beijing has evidence that they should have been putting sulfur scrubbers on their power plants when they were building. But it's like anything else in life. If you do it on the front end, it's a lot cheaper than if you build a big plant and then you're surrounded by communities and then you got to add something to clean the sulfur or whatever. So all these new power plants that are being built around the world should be built with Western Europe, U.S. type environmental technology on them.
They should be, but they're not.
They were not. So there's more and more that are, but there's still a lot that aren't.
Okay.
And but in the United States, I mean, taking all that manufacturing, we didn't grow demand for electricity by manufacturing for 30 years. Between 1980 and 2010, there was no increase in demand for electricity by the manufacturing sector to speak of.
Right.
And yet in China, it was growing up, double digits a year. And they were building the electric plants that were not environmentally sound. And yet we were claiming victory that we were doing a great thing. I mean, the movie stars feel great. Everybody feels great what they're doing. These advertisers are selling products to you all the time because they're environmentally friendly or whatever. But at the same time, we were both destroying American jobs and polluting the world because we were buying the very products at Walmart that we would have been buying from the local store, and they were made in China.
How much of the threat to coal, U.S. coal, isn't just exporting because of environmental decisions made by the bureaucracies, but also you are an advocate for capitalism and free markets, but you have alternative energy. You have natural gas. That's come on huge in the past 20 years. I think the United States is the biggest exporter now of natural gas?
I don't know if they're the biggest sector. Maybe I haven't looked at that.
They're up there if they're not.
Maybe, yeah,
right?
they're soon be a net exporter.
So is that also a competitive thing that impacted U.S. coal as well?
Yeah, it depends on what time frame you're talking about. In the last 5 to 10 years, the invent of horizontal drilling and the
fracking.
The fracking has, of course, they're attacking fracking now, but that's made it possible for natural gas to meet the demand. Prior to fracking and horizontal drilling, if you had tried to move natural gas prices would have been $10, a cubic foot. So
right.
That creation helped. But what is disturbing is that how many elements of the business community try to play environmentalists themselves. I mean, one thing that hurt the coal industry is you couldn't get banks to loan you any money. And so the gas industry, though, they're giving them money. It's almost like a kiting, if you know the accounting term. I mean, they give them money, they drill a well, the well exhausts, they give them more money, and the debt just keeps going up and up. So I don't know really what the cost of producing natural gas is because the debt...
What was preventing banks from lending in the mining industry?
What happens is, like your California friends, the calipers, California.
Yes, the pension.
Yeah, they come in and they'll tell Fidelity that if you loan money to a coal company, we'll pull all our billions of dollars out of your bank.
Wow.
So
this is purely political.
Yeah. It's a situation where the people who have bought into things like the Green Deal or that look at things that way have lost total sight of cost versus benefit, and they're playing God on the business community because they control the money. And it was, if you get money in the coal industry, it was expensive. If you could get it at all, you were down to just a few banks that would loan it, and yet the gas companies are basically being subsidized with bank money and debt.
Talking about subsidies, and I want to use that as a segue to go back to the politics, because let's go back to now 2008 and 2009. You now have a new president in the White House, and this president ran on essentially on green energy and changing, stopping the increase in the oceans and saving the world and the whole thing, right? So what happened when Barack Obama became president? It was a fairly quick shift from you guys as far as, from what I understand, the EPA, OSHA, MSHA. What took place in that first year?
Well, the craziness is probably in a single word. I mean, it's, if you don't think that regulation is political, all you have to do is look at the numbers of the violations that a union mine was getting under Bush or Clinton and the ones that they got under Obama. For example, a mine adjacent to UBB was getting far more violations under a Republican president than UBB was getting. But as soon as Obama came in, UBB was getting more violations than the union mine. So you can tell
UBB, Upper Big Branch mine.
Yeah,
that's the mine that exploded.
Right. You can tell. You can actually. It'd be interesting if a person had the time to do all the research on it. You can tell. You can see the political influence on the regulatory atmosphere by changes in who's in charge of the presidency or the Senate or who's been appointed to EPA or MSHA. It's sad because it demonstrates that it's not really about mine safety or about the environment. It's a political weapon, weaponized environmental rules and weaponized safety rules.
So what took place? And let's say Obama was inaugurated in January of 2009. What happened from there?
Well, some of the crazy things they did, of course, they added huge staffing to the Mine Safety and Health Administration. They began to do, as we talked about in detail at Upper Big Branch, they began to impose their will more and more on the mines. The regulators are supposed to set the goal of how much air, how much roof support, whatever, and then the company decides how to meet that goal. But what happened under Obama was not only were they setting the goal, they were telling you what you had to do it. They deny that, but they were. And the way they would do it, they wouldn't approve any plan, even if it met the law, that they didn't want that plan to be approved. And most of their objective was to slow down production. The Obama administration had the same belief that the United Mine Workers have: the less productive you are, the more jobs there will be, because it takes more people to produce the same amount of coal. So that philosophy, yeah, that's what they think. That philosophy permeated the entire industry of the coal industry. If in a mine, it's complicated, but if you're allowed to take a 30-foot cut before you back out and bolt the top, you'll be more productive than if you take a 20-foot cut and you back out several more times a day to bolt the top. So you mine, you come out, you bolt the top, you go back in and mine again. The further you're allowed to go, the more productive you can go, because the fewer times you have to do that.
Okay, and bolting the top, again, the terminology. So
it's putting steel rods up to make sure that once you remove the coal, the mountain above you will stay up.
Gotcha.
You drill a hole.
So you're girding, you're ensuring that it's not going to collapse.
So what the Obama administration and their former union guy that was head of MSHA did is they quit allowing people to take deep cuts in most situations. Most of southern West Virginia was losing their 30 and 40-foot cuts, and they were on 20-foot cuts.
Right.
They tried to act like that was more safe, but one of the most dangerous parts of mining is moving all this equipment around after you've made your cut. And they also turned off the scrubbers, which are the things that remove the dust from the air, which the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, the National Mining Association, the state associations, every operator was up in arms about turning off these scrubbers that remove the dust from the air. And yet administration was requiring that. But they were doing anything and everything they could do to decrease production and to frustrate the operators, and none of it was directed toward more safety or more environmental compliance.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. So now you're dealing with a regulatory state. You're still trying to run a successful mine. You have shareholders, stakeholders to answer to as a large corporation. Was this impacting your business model? Was it impacting profits? Obviously, you were spending more time on compliance and having, cutting lesser and so on and so forth. What impact did that have on Massey directly?
It probably cut our productivity as measured in tons per man hour by about 20%, which is
20%
huge.
difference.
Yeah, we were probably running, they measure productivity in a mine by how many feet you can mine per shift, and it probably cut us from 280 to 210.
Did that impact people's take home, their pay?
It impacted their bonuses, but the biggest thing it did was impact the competitiveness of coal with gas and coal with other sources, and it drove up the price of coal to U.S. steel mills and made them less competitive in the world steel market. It was having all kinds of impacts. It was putting people out of work, basically.
Okay. Now, it was around this time that you were starting to take notice of the impact on your company and on your coal miners. You started to become vocal, weren't you?
Well, I'd been vocal for a while, but I became more vocal, and it always is for CEOs of New York Stock Exchange companies, because you don't want to be too political, but sometimes you can't avoid the facts that the politics are affecting your business. But I was very vocal about it, and in fact, I can't remember the exact year, but I had a rally during Labor Day while John Kerry was having a Labor Day rally just a few miles down the road, and we drew 100,000 people, and he drew 3. So I had 100,000 people, largest single-day crowd in the history of West Virginia.
John Kerry ran in 2004. When was this?
I don't know that he was running that year.
Okay.
It might have been.
He was Secretary of State at the time?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. He came to, I remember it because he came to the United Mine Workers rally in a place called Racine, West Virginia. Okay. And even though he had voted against gun control, they gave him a rifle for his visit, so I remembered that. But that whole picture of how Obama was treating West Virginia and how the industry was being blackballed, if you will, as an industry, and they were helpless to do anything about it, is one of the reasons I got more and more politically involved.
Okay. And by being politically involved, that meant what? You started establishing more relationships with senators, with D.C., the swamp, so to speak?
Well, I became very vocal about global warming that we just touched on, and I still believe it, even though I think the left has won that issue. I think it's hurting the country. I think it's one of the reasons we aren't competitive, and I think mathematically it makes no sense, but people misunderstand. I don't represent that I understand science and the atmosphere enough to know whether CO2 will make a difference, not make a difference, whether 450 parts per million is okay and 600 parts per million, the world ends. I mean, I don't look at that. I just look at the math. The actions that this government has taken for the last 20 years have not decreased CO2 emissions, it's increased CO2 emissions.
Okay.
And that's the problem I have with that. And I was very outspoken about that, which was a big issue, and people knew that I was outspoken about it. And I was outspoken about, I used to have arguments even with my board. I can't stand in front of 7,000 coal miners and tell them I'm putting safety first and turn off our dust scrubbers and ventilate backwards. And I can't continue to do that. One or two things has to happen. I either have to leave or I got to keep speaking out so that the coal miners know that I'm genuine and I'm really concerned about them. So I was recommending to the board that we sue the Mine Safety and Health Administration for making us do things that were unsafe. But the board was afraid to do that because they were afraid that we'd get more retribution than we already have.
It was also simultaneously that the Obama administration was starting to push out favored stimulus packages to alternative energy. You had Solyndra and other green energy as well. Ultimately, Solyndra goes bankrupt, and
Nancy Pelosi, brother-in-law or brother or whatever.
Yeah, there was we talk about cronyism of some type there. But so it was during this time that it was obvious that the Obama administration were definitely putting their efforts and the money and the taxpayer money behind moving away from coal.
Right.
Correct? So from your seat, from your chair, and you were, again, very vocal about this, did you feel that they were attacking the entire industry? When Hillary Clinton ran in 2016, she said point blank, she says, you're not going to have jobs in the future to coal miners, okay?
Well, I felt, I use the analogy sometimes because my brother was one of the heroes of Hamburger Hill, and he walked point for a long time. In Vietnam,
Right.
they would have a guy walk point so that if he got snapped, and the rest of them knew that the guy walking point had been killed, because they'd hear the shot and everybody else would be warned. I walked point for the coal industry from probably 1984 until 2010. So there was no turning back for me. I mean, I had been representing coal and coal miners all my life. So,
Right.
and I tried to look at issues about the environment and so forth on a fair basis. But at the same token, that area needed to have coal, and so did the steel industry, and so did the manufacturing industry in the U.S.
Gotcha. We're going to take a quick break. When we get back, I want to continue with you through what took place, not just during the Obama administration and obviously with the explosion and the after effects of the explosion, but the court case, jail time, and then you decided to throw your hat in the ring politically as well. And I want to get into all of that. So Dave Sussman here, America's Voice News. We're going to be right back with Don Blankenship. Thanks for being with us. And welcome back. Dave Sussman here at America's Voice News. And we're continuing with Don Blankenship. And Don, so we're now, 2010, we have the tragedy, okay? Upper Big Branch mine, all right? Upper Big Branch. And so, as we talked about at the beginning of the interview, obviously devastation, several days for you. You probably didn't sleep, emotional, worried. And then from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the blame started, or they looked for somebody to blame. And it was you, it was Massey, it was the miners themselves.
Yeah, basically, Obama and the head of ILMSHA both came out and said that the operator blew up the mine. The head of ILMSHA went as far as to say ILMSHA didn't, which sort of indicated that maybe he thought they did, so I don't know. But essentially, the mine blew up, and they blamed the failure of the miners to change the miner bits and to keep the water sprays unplugged. And the fallacy with that claim is that it doesn't matter whether you have any water sprays or have any miner bits or anything if you don't have an explosive atmosphere.
Right.
The industry, all businesses in the United States focus on the root cause, they call it, of an accident. And anytime you're investigating an explosion in a coal mine, you first have to figure out how you ended up with an explosive atmosphere. Most people don't realize you can weld, you can barbecue, you could have a bonfire underground. So long as you don't have an explosive atmosphere, it won't be any different than it would be outside. So your first objective has to be, how did I end up with an explosive atmosphere? The government didn't do that because, as we talked earlier, the government cut the air in half. And one of the ways you keep from having an explosive atmosphere is don't cut the air in half, run as much air as you can. The second thing that they ignored, and they were tricky about it, and the way they spun it, is that in fact, all explosions in a coal mine are going to be from methane. But the general public doesn't understand that the methane can be contained in gases from one or two sources. They can be contained in coal gas, which the industry calls coal bed methane, or the methane can be contained in natural gas, which comes out of the ground. You can easily tell the difference when you chemically analyze the gas that was in the mine as between coal bed methane and natural gas, because natural gas has propane and ethane in it, and coal bed methane does not. And the analysis that even the government did of the gas coming out of the mine showed that it had ethane and propane in it, meaning it was natural gas. They have that on page 60 or 70 of their report, but they never said publicly that this mine blew up because of natural gas. In fact, I've wondered ever since how many mines in the United States blew up because of natural gas rather than coal bed methane. But every explosion that I'm aware of in the U.S. has always been blamed on coal bed methane.
MSHA reduced the airflow. They regulated the airflow to be reduced. Within hours, literally, you had the explosion of this being implemented. You have 119 mines. Was this the only mine that they required that of, or?
It was the only mine in West Virginia that they took the belt arrow away.
Okay, why? Why this particular mine?
They would say, I think, that it was just the first on their list, that they intended to do it everywhere because of their belief that the fire might come up on the belt line and be dangerous.
After the explosion, did they continue that with other mines as far as regulating that?
No, there's another story there. We had another long wall, and they wanted to make us change it even after the explosion. In the aftermath of the explosion, they were insisting that the other mine be changed, and I refused to do it. And they eventually backed down.
Okay.
But they misled the public on the explosion in two ways. They blamed it on on coal bed methane in the most people's mind because they didn't make a clear distinction that it was natural gas, and they claimed it was caused by the miners not keeping the bits changed out in the water sprays. And because of that, they claimed it was a coal dust explosion. But the problem with that claim is that forensics shows it clearly was a natural gas explosion, and it's not as complicated as people might think. In a coal dust explosion, you'll get temperatures over 2,000 degrees. In a natural gas explosion, you'll get temperatures around 1,200 degrees. And it's really a pretty simple matter of looking at what melted and what didn't melt and so forth, and how much the coal.
So I'm sorry, just so that I understand, the difference between a coal dust explosion and a natural gas explosion is due to what?
Well, the coal dust will explode if it is ignited by a spark, and the dust will actually be the explosion. It's so fine that it will burn in the air and expand through the mine and explode, the coal dust itself, which is different than the gas exploding. And the government claimed that this was a coal dust explosion caused by a small amount of methane. But it clearly was not, because we hired a renowned explosion expert that worked a lot in the oil industry, and he determined that the temperatures were not adequate for it to have been a coal dust explosion.
So it was closer to a natural gas explosion as far as the temperature goes?
Temperatures and cleanness. The way I characterized it for laymen is it was not powerful enough, dirty enough, or hot enough to have been a coal dust explosion. It didn't meet the criteria of explosive forces or of how much dirt it created.
So these are forensics that you put together, you had put together. Also now, so this happened in April of 2010?
April 5, 2010.
Okay, so let's talk about legal. What took place from there? You were, there was a grand jury. How long did that take?
The first thing that happened, along with President Obama saying that the explosion was caused by the operators, he also said he was going to make all the Department of Justice and other departments' resources available to hold whoever was responsible accountable. And after a year or two of investigation, they arrested a security guard at the mine for having thrown some documents away, which we actually had copies of. And they sent him to prison, I think, for 5 years, and they arrested one of the mine.
Why would a security guard be throwing away documents?
Well, it was quite a while after the explosion. I think he just thought that because the mine was down because of the explosion, he was just cleaning up. At least that would be his side of the story. Why he did it, I don't know. But it was irrelevant to their having the evidence they needed, because there were also copies of those documents. They were in duplicate form, and there were copies in the main office as well as the security guard.
So they went after him after what? Obstruction of justice, or?
Obstruction of justice, yeah.
Okay, but they had those documents anyway.
Yes.
Okay.
And then they got a guy who they said had run a miner without the methane monitor, totally separate, unrelated to the explosion, years before the explosion, and it was a long story as well, but he was cutting roof down on an off shift, and by law, I think you can check with a handheld and do a small amount of work, but anyway, he ran the miner because the replacement methane monitor also wouldn't work, and they were trying to get ready for the next shift, and he, I think, pled guilty to having running it. They sent him to prison too, but that's a practice that shouldn't happen, but it raises a lot of issues about having to go to prison it was more of a political show, I think, than an actual crime.
Mm-hmm. And so when was the grand jury convened?
Well, the grand jury was probably convened just less than a year after the explosion. And of course, I had attorneys, because all CEOs do in situations like that. Most of our vice presidents had attorneys. My attorneys were in contact with the prosecutors during that 4-year process, and the prosecutors told them I was not a target, was not a subject, that they weren't investigating me. And then I felt compelled, because they were blaming the miners and because I had always used every significant accident to improve safety procedures going forward, to do the documentary and say that, that's not what they say happens, not what happened. And when I did, I also made a list of like 10 safety improvements, including bifurcating MSHA and requiring, better ventilation, raising the ventilation minimums and all that. And it made Manchin so mad and so angry that he insisted that I be indicted. And so shortly after a U.S. Senator insisted that I be indicted, I was indicted and charged with SEC violation of a letter that I didn't write, that I had to sign as chairman, which said that we always try to comply with the law, and a letter that went out to public by saying basically the same thing, and for willfully violating mine safety laws. The interesting part about the willfully violating mine safety laws is when you get a violation, it's either classified as non-willful or willful, meaning you intentionally violated the law. In layman terms, the lawyers would disagree with this.
Right.
But willful meaning you intentionally did it, and non-willful meaning you didn't do it. This mine in 17 years had never had a willful violation, and yet they charged me for conspiracy to commit willful violations.
So you mentioned Senator Joe Manchin. He came after you feel, because of the documentary that was released in 2014.
Yeah, he said he was coming after me and wanted me indicted because I was insensitive to the families for having brought it up 4 years later and claimed that the reports were in error. But basically, they didn't want me to get the truth out there. They still know to this day that the investigation reports are false, that it was a natural gas explosion following a cut in the airflow, and the miners were not responsible.
Okay. So going through the trial here, you had 4 indictments, 3 felonies, 1 misdemeanor. Okay. If we can go to the end of the trial, obviously a lot of discovery that's going back and forth, a lot of money being spent. Tell me what took place towards the end here.
Well, one thing that was very interesting is President Obama had not been to West Virginia in 6 years. So when the trial appeared to be going bad for the prosecution, he showed up in Charleston under the guise of being there because of the drug epidemic in West Virginia, and they shut down the trial for a day, and I think they all got together and had a meeting.
Was this 2016?
This was during the trial in 2016, yeah.
Okay.
And but basically the trial was, a kangaroo trial from the beginning. One of the first witnesses was an FBI agent who said he had kept all the evidence under lock and key and was there when it was taken and all that kind of stuff, or whatever he said, and turned out he wasn't even working at the FBI at that time. And attorneys would understand this better than laymen, but we were denied recross. They put on a lot of their case during redirect. They would put on a witness and they would ask him a bunch of questions, and then we get to cross-examine him, but then they would come on redirect. In one particular case with their number 2 witness, they put in 61 exhibits on redirect, and the judge wouldn't let us recross. And one of the easy to understand fallacies of this is that, they basically would just not even bring in an MSHA inspector. There was not a single MSHA inspector that testified, even though the case was based on us getting 865 violations. There was not an MSHA inspector that appeared in the courtroom.
As an expert witness? None?
As any kind of witness. They would not bring an MSHA inspector in the room.
Why?
Because they knew that on cross he would be in trouble. We would ask him about the ventilation and so forth, and the judge wouldn't uphold our motion and our objection that by Constitution you're assured the right to face your accusers.
Right.
And I was being charged with excessive violations. The guys that wrote the violations never came to trial. I use the analogy, it's like a traffic ticket. Even if you get a traffic ticket going home and and you don't want to pay the fine and you go to court, the state policeman has to show up and testify that he was the guy that caught you speeding. But in this case, they never brought anybody in that wrote any one of the violations.
What do you think, obviously, ultimately, everybody knows by now, the 3 felonies were dismissed, right?
Yes.
What do you think the reasoning was for that, the primary reason?
Well, the case was just crazy. The SEC and the public letter, which was both the same letter, had a sentence in it that said that we always strive to comply with the mine safety laws. I didn't write the letter. I didn't edit the letter. I didn't propose the idea of even sending out a letter. It was done by our investor relations department in a multi-billion-dollar corporation.
Massey.
I was asked to sign it. It was in the aftermath of the explosion, just a few days. I don't think we'd even found all the bodies yet. They flew me by helicopter to the office to do that and to sign a bunch of insurance checks and to get people's last payrolls out and do a whole bunch of administrative. And among that was this document. And of course, it came out in trial that I didn't write it. I hardly read it. I didn't conceive of it. What it said was true, and the jury found me not guilty. That was 25 years in prison for 13 words that I didn't write. So, but we went through, 2.5 months of trial about it. And then the other one was about, it sounds horrible to say willful violation of mine safety laws, but the government argued that the 3 elements of my willful violation of the laws was didn't budget enough people to run the mine to be safe, which I didn't do the budget. One of them was the miners were telling each other when inspectors would arrive, and that that was violative of the law, although you can't find an attorney that tells you it violates the law, that once the inspector comes on the property, the inspection has begun, and if Joe tells Jack the inspector's out here, that's not illegal, but the government argued that it was. And one of them was not budgeting enough money for capital equipment. So you got a CEO running a $7.5 billion company at one of the coal mines, and they tried to put me in prison calling it willful violation to violate mine safety laws because a 30-some-year-old prosecutor who had never been in a coal mine in his life didn't think I budgeted enough people. The miners were telling each other, the inspectors had arrived, and that he thought we should have more equipment, which they couldn't prove, really.
How was that I guess from a standpoint of MSHA, and there's regulations on that, but how was that illegal? How was that a felony?
It's not.
I know it wasn't. It didn't end up being one, but the charge.
But no one had ever been charged with it before. In fact, we later learned, I don't know if you know the term Brady, but Brady material is material that would prove you to be innocent that the government's required to turn over. But what we later discovered was that when the MSHA was investigating the explosion and started to talk about the miners telling each other, the inspectors had arrived, that the investigators and regulators, inspectors themselves told them they didn't know that was against the law. It happens all the time.
Okay.
In fact, there were people in the industry that said the only time they ever knew that an inspector was coming was when the inspector told them. The law was written to keep inspectors from telling you that we're coming tomorrow to look at certain part of the mine. It was never written that 2 miners couldn't tell each other that the inspector had arrived. And yet they had never written a violation for it in their life. They had never charged anybody with it before. And they charged me, and I hadn't been in that mine in 10 years. But I wouldn't have even thought of it as a problem. I grew up in the coal mines, and if an inspector or the president of the company or anybody, a big customer was outside, they would tell each other, and everybody, that's just what you do. Everybody always does that.
So 3 felonies are dismissed. Decades in jail. Okay. Misdemeanor. What was the misdemeanor for?
It was for the willful violation of the mine safety laws, but not the element of, and for the purpose of to defraud the government. So it's a felony if you're convicted of willful violating mine safety laws for the purpose of defrauding the government, but it's not a felony if you conspire to commit willful violations, which I don't understand why, but that is the legal distinction.
The violations being what exactly? Because the flow of air?
It can be a lack of airflow. It can be not having rock dusted, which is to keep the mine clean so the coal dust won't get up in the air. It can be not having motors covered so that the man could get his hand in there and get hurt. It can be anything from a toilet won't flush in the bathroom. It can be anything. Which
are standard infractions on the regulations when they come in and do an inspection anyway, right? You pay a fine and you get it fixed and so on.
That's right, and that's the whole thing. It's civil violation. It's like being sent to prison for a traffic ticket.
Okay. And you were sent to prison?
Yes.
For a misdemeanor?
Yeah, my lawyers told me 110% I would not go to prison, and yet I did, yeah.
Okay, I want to get into more of this because this was kind of a turning point for you. And after the break, I want to talk about, number one, prison, and after prison, your political involvement as well. Dave Sussman, America's Voice News, with Don Blankenship. We'll be right back. And welcome back, Dave Sussman here, and we're continuing with Don Blankenship. So Don, as we just were discussing, you got this now, you've got a misdemeanor situation here, okay? And your attorneys?
Telling me 110% will not go to jail.
Will not go to jail. Nobody would have expected you to go to jail, but you did. Okay, up until the very last hour before you were supposed to show up. Is that correct? What happened there?
Well, when I went to sentencing, she sentenced me to prison to report in a few weeks, and as time approached, my attorneys had filed an emergency appeal, and they kept telling me that the appeals court will never let you go to prison before you have an appeal hearing, and they kept telling me not to bother to report. But I knew that if I didn't report, I'd break another law and subject to an extension of up to a year in the term I'd have to serve. So I went to Bakersfield, California, and spent the night not far from Taft the night before I was supposed to report. And sure enough, the appeals court ruled that I did have to report. And these criminal attorneys have been attorneys for 30 and 40 years. They were just shocked.
So this is a misdemeanor, and as you referred to earlier, you said that this is the equivalent of a traffic violation. Okay, nobody serves a year in jail for a traffic violation, okay, especially first-time offender. So this is a judge. There was an appellate court that you guys went to?
Yes, all Obama appointees. I think there was one Clinton appointee during the whole process, and I had like 5 or 6 judges during the whole time, but they continued to send me to prison for a misdemeanor.
Okay, so I have to ask you this because you're overseeing a multi-billion-dollar global organization, okay? And now you're going to prison. What was going through your mind?
Well, it was strange because, as I tell everybody, you know, I was a guy that even puts the toilet seat down every time. I don't curse. I'm a Sunday school guy, so I was amazed that the American system could send someone like me to prison. I mean, I shut down corruption in the coal company when I first took over. Didn't ever break the law. In fact, they investigated me for probably 4.5 years. They looked at every campaign contribution. They talked to every company we were doing business with. They talked to coal miners. They couldn't find anything that I had done illegally. That's the reason they charged me with the 13 words that I didn't write and a crime that no one had ever heard of. So, you know, I'd already been shocked. So here I am going to prison for a misdemeanor. And it was really interesting. You know, you go there and they treat you fairly nice until your family leaves, and then they strip you down and search you and put you in an orange outfit and walk you across the prison yard a lot like they would in Shawshank Redemption or did. And the prisoners had all watched 60 Minutes, and they'd all seen that I was the coal guy that, quote, killed 29 coal miners. So that was interesting. And some of the prisoners were offering me, you know, bodyguard service, and others were threatening me. So I was advised fairly quickly by some of the guys that had been there for a long time not to tell the prison guards that I was afraid, because if I did, they'd put me in a hole, which, you know, and you'd be
Solitary confinement.
Solitary confinement in order to protect me. So it was interesting. I remember I told one of the guards, I asked one of the guards, I said, "How many misdemeanors have you got here?" And he said, "This is a federal prison, buddy. There's no misdemeanors in this prison." And I said, "Well, I know of one." And he said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, I am a misdemeanor." He said, "There's no way." So he turned to his buddy and said, "This guy claims he's a misdemeanor." And that guy says, "It can't be." But his boss went and looked, and sure enough, they had a misdemeanor. So it was the first one that I know of to be in that prison, but certainly the only one at that time.
What were the other criminals like? What were they serving time for?
Being coyotes, bringing people across, a lot of drug dealers.
The border.
Yeah, bringing people from Mexico. In fact, my first roommate was a coyote. And but there's...
You had a roommate. How big was your cell?
Probably about 7 by 12, real small. You have a bunk bed on each side and just enough room to walk in between it, and then you have a cabinet at the end of it, cinder block walls.
We're in a beautiful home. What was that like for you, going down into a
Well, you know, it's funny.
box like that?
You know, I told the story during when I ran for office that you know, in the first part of my life, I used an outhouse, and then after that, I was fortunate enough to you know, get to go to a coal mine and bathe at a bathhouse, and eventually I got to go to the White House and have a private dinner, and then I found my way to the big house. So I had so many experiences, worked in low coal, been without money. At one time I had to choose whether to buy gas or eat, and I ate and ran out of gas when I was like 20-some years old. So it's not like I wasn't capable of being in prison. I mean,
Okay.
a lot of people go crazy, you know, but I'd had enough tough knocks that it wasn't so difficult for me as you might think.
Physically, you obviously were able to adapt. Your childhood gave you that rearing. But emotionally, you were angry.
Yeah, it was hard to figure out. The emotions are really strange. You know, you're mad. You're also extremely shocked that this government is as corrupt as it is. I mean, the realization for a guy who was raised to respect. You know, we stood outside and said the pledge and sang "God Bless America," even if it was snowing when I was in grade school in a small town in West Virginia. So. It was hard for me to adjust to the fact that they had intentionally put me in prison for something that not only did I not do, but they knew I didn't do.
So what was going through your mind? Were you, I mean, you have a lot of time. You have a lot of time to think. What were you doing?
Well, a lot of what happens is your attorneys are still telling you that they're going to get you out. So, you know, in a way that's bad. In a good way, it sort of gives you a focus. You know, in 60 days,
Right.
We're going to do this, we're going to do that. So I turned to doing the writing, and I got so much mail that they had their own mailbag for me. They had one mailbag for me and one mailbag for the rest of the dorm.
What kind of letters were you getting?
I got death threats. Probably 5%, you know, were from people that were angry at me, but most of them were from people, friends. You know, I had I don't know how many dozens of character letters, people saying that there's nobody more honest, there's nobody done more for safety, there's nobody that's a better person. So the judge just threw all those letters away, but those people continued to write to me the whole time I was in prison.
Were these families, local families in West Virginia?
They were a whole group of people, every religion, whether it be Muslim or Jewish or Christian. It was from 90-year-old black ladies. It's from guys that worked in the mines from me. It was from kids drawing cartoons where I'd given money to the school or build a gymnasium. It was, you know, the whole spectrum of people and types of people and people that understood.
That must have been uplifting for you. Dark
Yeah.
time for you. But
Yeah, that was good, and I answered every one of them.
Did you really?
So that took time. you
Okay.
know,
And you also started working on another project.
Which part is you speaking of?
So I mean, from what I understand, when you were in there, you wrote a pamphlet.
Yeah, I wanted people to be able to see, so I wrote a pamphlet that included the atrocities of the explosion, the atrocities of the trial, the politics of what had gone on. It was just, maybe, I don't remember now, 50 or 60 pages.
Okay.
But that took some time because you had to handwrite it, and you'd have no copy machine. You have nothing to work with, so you send it out, and you have somebody type it for you and send it back in. Mm-hmm. And nearly got in trouble with the pamphlets. As a little story, when I finally got them done, they mailed me a bunch of them in, and I gave them to the prisoners, and then they called me to the warden's office and said, you can't do that. So, but I think it gave the prisoners in there an uplift too, because a lot of them feel like they were violated and given excess sentences, and
okay.
It made me pretty popular with the guys that I was, doing what I was doing.
Okay. So after 60 days, your attorneys come back to you and say what?
That they ruled against us, but that we're reappealing or something. I can't remember the exact, but it was it was a shock to them. But it became obvious probably after I was there about 4 months that I was going to serve the full time. And another little peculiarity, to give you an idea of how poorly thought out the law is, if you get sentenced to a year as a misdemeanor and you're not on drugs, you serve 10 months. If you get sentenced as a felon to 366 days and you're on drugs, you can get out in 6 or 7 months. So you serve longer if you're sentenced as a misdemeanor and you don't have any vices than if you're sentenced as a felon.
In every case, or just yours?
Every case. The law is that if you're sentenced to 366 days, that you can be granted 60 days early relief. But if you're sentenced to 365, you're not eligible for early release. And the law is that if you need GED training or education, or you need a drug course or whatever because you're drug addicted, you can get extra time off. But if you're a clean-cut CEO that's convicted of a misdemeanor and sentenced 365 days, you serve your time.
It was I think it was your pamphlet that you used the words, I'm a political prisoner. Okay. Which politician, when you say that, are you referring to Obama? Are you referring to the unions? Are you referring to West Virginia? Where was your mind?
I'm referring to the fact that I was a non-establishment type of guy that believed that you shouldn't tax food, you shouldn't indebt the state and put the money in the stock market, you shouldn't be ruling in favor of every claimant, you shouldn't be allowing violence to take place during strikes. I had fought all those issues for years and years, so I was politically engaged in my mind out of necessity. And because of my political outspokenness and my unwillingness to accept everything from union violence to climate change, I was targeted by Barack Obama and Joe Manchin and the people that they had appointed to the court system and so forth, and to make a point that if you exercise your free speech and it has results, they will lock you up. And that's basically what happened. My outspokenness had made a difference. It turned blue to red. It caused the demise of the United Mine Workers. It kept the coal industry running. It had had a lot of success, and so not only did they send me to prison, by the way, even before they sent me to prison, they put me under a gag order.
For how long?
Well, it would have been for who knows how long, except that the press filed an appeal to the Fourth Circuit and got the gag order reversed for me. That was
the press did that?
Yeah.
For what purpose?
Because they gagged everybody. They gagged all the witnesses. They gagged the lawyers. They gagged me. They wouldn't allow anybody to talk about the trial.
Well, I want to get to the press here because a lot of people are watching this. Some people are going to be wondering, why do you have this guy on? Everything we know about him is it's nasty. People have died, and I want to talk about your campaign here in just a moment as well. But the press created, I think, from just observing everything that I've seen, getting ready to meet with you and sit down with you, they created in I think America's mind a villain in you. And everything that I've heard thus far, and we're not to the campaign yet, so I'm going to ask some questions that you may not like about the campaign, but the fact is that it didn't sound to me like you did anything that should have put you in jail for 12 months, especially going through the horror of watching families that are you helped, put food on their table for, you grew up with, and watching them lose loved ones.
It's worse than I can express. They put me in prison because I'm a good guy, because they could not afford to have someone that was influencing public opinion without doing it illegally. They were losing the battle. I mean, they had shot at me, literally. The strike had gone on. I won the strike. I went out to defeat Warren McGraw because he was an activist judge that was destroying West Virginia's economy. I won. They didn't like it. I beat the food tax. Then I beat the bond. And then I put a candidate on every House of Delegate state race in West Virginia on a Republican ticket for the first time probably in 80 years,
right,
and turned the West Virginia legislature red. They couldn't take it anymore. And that's what we'll talk about in a moment in the election. When it got to where they couldn't take it anymore, they did obviously crazy things.
Yeah.
In this case, they convicted me of something that is not a crime and sent me to prison for a misdemeanor.
Do you see any parallels between what you went through and what Donald Trump has gone through for the past 2.5 years with the whole idea of a Russian collusion narrative that was just, obviously, Mueller said didn't exist?
Yeah, I see a lot of parallels. I mean, I think, number one, I said during the campaign that I was Trumpier than Trump, meaning that I believe in the tariffs. I believe
Trumpier than Trump.
Yeah,
right.
I believe personality-wise we're totally different, and I think our behavior is different. But I believe that the tariffs should be objective instead of subjective. I think you can sell the tariffs on the basis that you want to improve human rights and you want to make sure that the environment is taken care of. I think that the regulations need to be reduced because many of them, the cost benefit is just totally out of balance. And I think that you have to give the American worker a chance to compete, because you can't, at some point, the debt is going to destroy the country. So I understand that. The thing that I'm different than Trump, in addition to personality, I would never have surrounded myself with swampers and planned to drain the swamp. I would have surrounded myself with people from other parts of the country that agreed with the philosophy that the swamp needed to be drained. But on tariffs, taxes, regulations, illegal immigration, the wall, I'm very much Trump.
And Trump was a threat to the system on a national level.
Yeah, to answer your question, yeah, his threat to the swamp and his threat to the establishment is one of the reasons that he's been unfairly attacked. My situation is different in that it was very personal. They're not attacking. I mean, they knew me. I'm walking among them. And the union battles were real. I mean, I carried a machine gun for a year. I mean, it was face-to-face type stuff. So it's different in that regard.
Yeah.
Very much more personal, if you will.
Yeah, and you actually took real bullets. Yeah. Okay, so going back to jail, was there a moment in jail that you made a decision that you were going to become politically involved?
Well, again, I'd already been politically involved. But
out front.
Right. I guess I didn't make a decision to run for office. I made the decision that what had been done to me, the best use I could make of it was to help others that had the same problem and didn't have the resources to deal with it.
Okay.
So I knew I had the resources. I knew I was clean. And that's the one thing that anybody that thinks about this should understand. You do not sue the national media and call Mitch McConnell Cocaine Mitch, or say Ditch Mitch, or stand up on the public scene and say what I've said if you feel like you're guilty of anything. If I thought I was guilty of anything, tax evasion, whatever, I would not have the courage to do that. The thing that gives you the courage is knowing that you're not guilty and that they can't get you. And if I thought they could get me for a traffic ticket, I wouldn't do what I'm doing. So that is the biggest thing I think people miss. They think this guy's got to be crazy to be doing what he's doing. He's killed 29 people, he's this, he's that. Anybody that killed 29 people wouldn't dare do it. There's no statute on murder. So anybody that thinks that I would do this if I were guilty is not thinking very clearly.
So when were you released from prison?
I was released, I think it was, what would that have been? That would have been March of 2017, right?
Okay.
To a halfway house. I was in the halfway house on and off as you're required to be until
Right.
About that time in 2018 last year.
Okay, and you were doing what at this time? Because you were about to throw your hat into the primary for West Virginia Senate.
Well, when I first got out, I decided that I would, if you will, stick it in the eye a little bit about the documentary I did. I started running commercials that the cover-up at UBB was worse than Benghazi. And Fox wouldn't run it, most of the stations wouldn't run it, but a lot of the local TV stations ran it. And I ran ads about MSHA destroying documents because we were discovering that they had destroyed documents. I was running ads about the prosecution. I was running ads about being sent to prison for a misdemeanor. I was running ads about the judges being Obama appointees.
Did you get any pushback about the Benghazi parallel, the comparison? Because that's a very emotional issue right there for America.
Oh, I've had some pushback from people about it, but it's true. In Benghazi, the people were killed by terrorists, and the cover-up by claiming it was about a song or something made no sense and so forth. But MSHA killed the guys.
About the video, the YouTube video,
right,
that was used as an excuse?
Yeah, and the reason UBB was worse is they killed those guys and then claimed that they killed themselves. So they were the ones that killed.
You're talking about terrorists versus just malfeasance of a regulatory agency.
Well, I don't know if I call it malfeasance. I mean, when you ignore a 45-year veteran of your own organization and force them to change the airflow, and the mine explodes a few hours later, and then you claim that they did it, and then you destroy documents at a shredding party during the investigation, and then you demand that the guy who's exposing you be put in prison for life and try him for things he didn't do. I don't know, 29 is more than 5, and doing it yourself.
Gotcha. Where did the animus towards Mitch McConnell come from?
Well, he attacked me with negative ads is where most of it came from. I mean,
you felt like he started it. It was.
Yeah, I mean, he's showing a house on TV that he claimed was my house, and I hooked it up to, city water while I was polluting other people's wells. And that's, first of all, it wasn't my house that he had in the picture, but more so, they were just repeating a lawsuit filing by some people in West Virginia. And, you can, if you wanted to slander somebody, all you got to do is go over here and get Joe Blow to file a lawsuit and then quote what's in the lawsuit, because you can sue anybody for anything. But basically, they started that back and forth, and of course, that ended up with Cocaine Mitch. And because if you notice,
talk about this, because it's funny because we see the memes of Cocaine Mitch. I don't think a lot of people know where this came from. Talk about the Cocaine Mitch story and his wife and the father-in-law, the genesis of this, if you can.
Well, I guess the genesis of it, I was on talk radio in West Virginia, and the guy was asking me questions about tariffs and trade policy and currency wars and so forth and so on. And I said that, we need to be concerned because McConnell controls the legislation and his family has ties to China, that his dad's a China person, and his wife who's on the transportation, on the cabinet transportation, and his sister-in-law is formerly on the what they call Shipbuilding Company of China, which has as a mission making the Chinese Navy more militarily strong than the U.S. Navy. And with a currency war going on, having someone in the same family as the Senate Majority Leader that it's on the Bank of China board raises conflict of interest issues, and they turned that into a racist comment. Had nothing to do with the Chinese. My fiance's Chinese. Had nothing to do with anything about race. Had to do with whether having family members closely tied to the the China government, was perhaps a conflict of interest with decisions that were being made in D.C. about currency and trade tariffs.
Okay. So, cocaine Mitch. We're talking about majority Senate leader, Mitch McConnell. For all intents and purposes, a lot of people, whatever your opinion is of him as a politician or a person, a lot of conservatives feel that he has been very instrumental in passing nominations through the judicial. We've seen Supreme Court justices and appellate court justices all go through. And so when you hear something like Cocaine Mitch, do you feel that that was appropriate at that time? Was that going to shift was it going to open up a discussion about the issues that you wanted to talk about? Or was it for something else? Was it to bring attention to your campaign? What was the thinking behind it?
Well, I think in combination with the China conflict of interest and the fact that he's never denied, to my knowledge, that the ship that belonged to his family was carrying cocaine in Colombia, into Europe at least. And so,
well, there was a report that came out that showed that that the company had nothing to do with it, right? There was no ill intent there. It was one of the ships in a line, and there was a box that had some cocaine in it. It's like Ronald McDonald when you have a bad hamburger.
Yeah, I don't place a lot of trust in government reports, which
Okay.
you might have learned during the interview. I don't believe them, but my point was that if you're actually anti-swamp, if you actually want to change the establishment, you can't have Mitch McConnell be in charge of what's going to pass legislation and what's not. And once he, started to run negative ads against me with a $1.5 million spend in West Virginia, which is a big spend, it opened the door for whatever was true. I wanted to bring attention to the fact that this guy got $40 million or so from his father-in-law, i.e. to his wife and to the family, part of which he won the last campaign, and that they do have close ties to China, and that they did have cocaine on the ship, and that they're still buying big ships out of China. And in many cases, Ms. Chow, that's on the Transportation Department, is in a position to influence the Jones Act on
Senator McConnell's wife.
Yeah, and all that. So I wanted to bring attention to it. As you know, it's hard to get the media to pay attention to, really important things that don't have a lot of marketability to them.
Well,
Cocaine Mitch had a lot of marketability.
You certainly drew attention to it. Like I said, memes, okay? And I think a lot of people don't even know what Cocaine Mitch means, but it came from this. And so we were talking during the break. You ended up on the Fox debate, and do you want to talk about that story real quickly?
Well, that debate was interesting because they said that you couldn't have a prop, and I didn't know that before I got there, and I had a hat on that said Ditch Mitch, and they demanded that I take it off, and that you couldn't have the hat on during the debate. So I told them I just wouldn't debate.
Okay.
And they said, well, you can't not just debate because we're ready to go and we know you're not going to turn down a national media thing. And I said, well, I don't think you're going to have a debate with an empty podium, and you've built it all over the United States that I'm going to be on here, so I think you'll let me wear the hat. And it went back and forth up until about the time to go on the air, and they finally agreed that if I would not wear the hat, that they would show the hat. But they were real concerned about how angry Mitch might be about it.
The Ditch Mitch hat.
The Ditch Mitch hat. But I think it's if you're going to run as a non-establishment candidate, if you're truly planning to drain the swamp, you have to take out people that are clearly part of the swamp. Right. And even though I too am glad that Gardner didn't get on the Supreme Court, and glad that the other guys did, it shows the willingness to break the rules, if you will. I mean, I would rather have a government and argue left and right issues, and it be an honest government, and a government that follows the rules, because the rules would have kept me out of prison. Following the Constitution would have kept me out of prison. So I don't like seeing that we're willing to break the rules for whichever ideology we hold.
The left still think that the Supreme Court was stolen, the Garland nomination. Second, you had some campaign commercials. Now, if you watch some of the news reports, if you watch the John Oliver episode, they play your campaign commercials, and you refer to using the term China person, which, okay, I don't see it as racist, but a lot of people did. And like you said, your fiance.
I don't think they did.
Right. Well, okay, but and you see it through the lens of a John Oliver show, and it really. Let me ask you from this way: do you have any regrets about that campaign?
No.
None.
No, I'm happy about it because I'm going to show.
The commercials?
Yeah, what the campaign will ultimately result in is exposing the national media and the Republican and Democratic establishment as being pure swampers.
Yeah.
So I'm happy that I wish would have won the election.
Right.
But actually, what happened is they exposed themselves to prevent me from winning the election, and that exposure may be more valuable to actually making a difference than having been a senator.
Now, the national press were referring to you as a convicted felon all throughout the campaign.
Well, no, not all throughout the campaign.
Well, if you go to your Wikipedia page, it still says it on there, convicted criminal, convicted felon. You're not. It was a misdemeanor.
Yeah, the point I was making is I was running for office from January to sometime in April, and they didn't call me a felon until April the 24th, when it became apparent, and my opponents, Morrissey and Jenkins, began to complain to the Republicans that I was going to win if they didn't do something.
Okay. And that's where you feel that Mitch McConnell put his thumb on the scale?
No, I don't feel that. I know that.
You know
he
that,
said
right?
that. He said it on TV.
Okay. So the Attorney General, I'm sorry, his name again? He won.
Patrick Morrissey.
Patrick Morrissey. He came within a few points of Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin ultimately won. A lot of people believe that he won because he was one of the most important votes on the Kavanaugh hearing. Okay, and he went against the Democrats. He went with the Republicans, and that's what a lot of people believe he won, because I think he only won by a couple of points, right?
He won 0.6%, I think. Maybe it was a little more than that. But anyway,
Yeah.
he won because McConnell didn't want Morrissey to win.
Okay. You're saying he didn't want Morrissey to win. The Republican. McConnell did not want the Republican to win. He wanted Joe Manchin to win.
All the actions of the NRSC and McConnell would indicate to me that they did not want to beat Manchin.
Okay. This is about what? Power?
I would say, Manchin voted for Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, and he was viewed as the link between the left and the right, and Fox likes him and everybody likes him, so they weren't really motivated to beat him.
So we spoke about this briefly earlier. I guess I'm trying to get my head around this a little bit here, because if I'm the Senate Majority Leader, I want as many senators in name with an R in my column. I want 54, not 53. I want 55, not 52. Okay? So you think Morrissey would have voted against the Republicans on these?
No. I just think that that sometimes relationships and friendships and trade-offs happen. And in my opinion, and keep in mind that nobody thought I had a chance and I was in the lead before they started calling me a felon. And I converted West Virginia from blue to red. I beat people that were unbeatable in Brigham and others' opinions. In my opinion, they did not want to beat him. They only had to run 3 commercials to beat Manchin. One was when Schumer glanced at him and he sat down. One was when he was supporting
I remember that. That's State of the Union, right?
Right. One was when he was supporting Barack Obama for president, and one when he was campaigning with Hillary Clinton in southern West Virginia. If they'd ran those 3 commercials.
Hillary Clinton, who said that you don't have a future in coal here, folks. You're going to get a new job.
We're going to give Iran $150 million and give you $1 billion and take out all your jobs, with Manchin at our side, which she put me in her book, by the way.
Interesting.
But they didn't really see Manchin as a big enough reason to beat him, and of course he had voted for the Supreme Court. It's hard to tell what else he agreed to. And keep in mind that the Senate does not want me to be there because they know that I will ask for a reinvestigation of UBP, Upper Big Brain.
So we were talking briefly earlier. There's now a report and I want to make sure I get it, the OPR. Okay, this is from the Department of Justice's auditing.
Yeah, they have what's called an Office of Professional Responsibility, which reviews prosecutor conduct in convicting people to make sure people are getting a fair trial.
Okay, and what has that report stated?
That the prosecutors were guilty of negligent misconduct, that they may have lied to the judge, that they believe that they did lie to the judge, that they purposely withheld Brady material in violation of the law, including...
Brady material is?
It's evidence that the FBI and the investigators discovered that would prove you innocent. For example, they knew that their lead witnesses had said that I did not conspire with them, that they never broke the law. They had all kinds of testimony during investigation interviews that showed that I was not guilty, and they kept all of it. They didn't give it to us like they were required to by law.
When did this come out?
Came out last summer for the most part. Okay. It also came out that MSHA had disciplined their own inspectors for putting the ventilation plan in, and they hid those documents. They shredded documents about UBB employees. It even came out that employees, regular workers at MSHA, had made sworn statements that they had altered the signatures on documents, altered the dates, threw the ventilation plans away that were in place before, and that the prosecutors were aware of it, but had determined that they wouldn't prosecute it. And yet the prosecutor told the judge that he was not aware of it. But we later learned that not only was he not aware of it, that the Solicitor General's office had investigated it and asked the prosecutor if he wanted to charge anybody for it, and he said that he did not. So he told the judge that he didn't even know these things had occurred, but in fact, he not only knew they had occurred, he was asked by the Solicitor General's office if he wanted to charge the people that had done it, and he said that he did not.
You must have felt very validated when they reported this on the nightly news that night.
Well, that was the part that was amazing. There was reporters in the courtroom during all this stuff.
Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. It didn't get any exposure.
Didn't get any exposure.
Okay.
And you know, when you ask me about McConnell, or you ask me about Manchin, or you ask me about any of them, I sent that pamphlet to every legislator and judge in the United States, state, federal, everybody. I've sent letters. I hand carried the safety advice I give to Manchin's office. I've run commercials all over the country. I put ads in Politico magazine. I put them in national magazines. Not a single word. And yet Senator Thune, Senator McConnell, Senator Flake, they go around talking about they don't want somebody like me to win because I taint the Republican Party. It's really amazing to me that they seem to think that the DOJ is dishonest, but they won't take the time to look at what happened here.
Okay. It's now 2019, and you have made news in the past few weeks. You've filed a lawsuit, and not a small one. You're filing it against many in the national media, including Fox News, personalities, including Judge Napolitano. What's all this about?
It's about collusion by the national media and the U.S. Senate, and probably including some in the U.S. House, to corrupt an election for federal office. And they're guilty. There's no question about that.
$2 billion plus 10 punitive, $12 billion lawsuit.
Yeah, as we talked earlier, I increased the value of Massey by $7.6 billion, and most of that was in the last few years when I was running it. So I think I can show $2 billion in damages, and I think that AT&T and Comcast and all these big companies, I think it takes 2 months for AT&T to make $10 billion. So
obviously this isn't about the money.
No, I don't need any money.
You don't need any money. So the intention of this is to do what?
It's to drain the swamp. I believe that the Senate and the House are violating the law to begin with. The Federal Election Commission law is that you can't have meetings in offices, in the government offices, and talk about politics or solicit money or whatever. And the ideal that the Senate Majority Leader, who has no right to interfere in the West Virginia election can control PAC money in the millions of dollars. And the NRC this year will probably collect $500 and some million, and that they are doing it because, you know, who's not going to give a U.S. senator's Republican Party money? I mean, if you're running, you know, some big corporation and you're asked to make a donation, you're going to make a donation. And those guys are controlling who the future senators are going to be. And they're getting the cooperation of the press. You know, Manchin, for example, when he was governor, it was my understanding, at least I couldn't prove it, that he would tell people that if you don't do what we want, talking to the media, we won't run any lottery advertising on your network, and we won't run any tourism advertising on your network. That's even bigger at the federal level, and with these big corporations like AT&T and so forth. I mean, they have tremendous control. If McConnell says, I'm never going to come on your network again if you don't do X, Y, or Z, then they do X, Y, or Z.
What are you expecting to happen as a result of this lawsuit?
Well, one thing that needs to happen is we need to have fair elections. You know, the public figure thing needs to be done away with. I mean, it's an oxymoron. You can't influence public opinion if you're not a public figure. So if the government officials, the McConnells of the world, even a president or anybody, can say you're a felon because you're a public figure and therefore you lose your ability to influence public opinion, how do you ever make a change? So I want to clear the hurdle that's currently in place of the public figure law, but make it clear that only public figures can change public opinions. The law is insane.
If you had Mitch McConnell sitting in my chair right now, what would you say to him?
That the biggest problem in this country is dishonesty in the federal government, and if he would just be honest, he'll leave a much better legacy than what he's doing.
And Joe Manchin?
Probably the same issue. In addition to that, I would say that senators should not be saying on one morning that they don't know the facts about what happened at UBB, but saying the next day that someone should be indicted for what happened at UBB. That he needs to grow up and not look at just himself. He needs to look at protecting the integrity of the system and being fair to people, and get away from just being a politician, be a senator.
And to the families of the miners?
That the government blamed your loved ones for killing themselves and they didn't do it. And that I will stand up for the coal miners because they can't speak for themselves. I know they didn't kill themselves. I know that they were the best coal miners in the world. They had 200 years of experience collectively. And they ran that coal mine as well as they knew how to run it. And they would not have cut the air in half had it not been made to do so.
Don Blankenship, I know the story's not over. I appreciate everything you're doing, and look forward to seeing how this whole thing with the lawsuit turns out. I'm sure we'll continue to keep up with you and see what happens next. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And I wish you the best of luck with everything.
I appreciate it. We'll have a lot of luck, but we've got a lot of things on our side too.
Indeed.
Thank
you very much. And thank you for watching. I'm Dave Sussman with America's Voice News. Again, very special thanks to Don Blankenship, and we'll be back again very soon. Cheers.